In today's Transport Committee meeting, for those of you following us online, hashtag this morning is Assembly Transport, my apologies. Just got a few formal notices before we go into the meeting. Just to ask, have we received any apologies for absence, please?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for absence from Assembly Member McCartney.
Fantastic. Just to repeat that we have a really lively discussion on transport now and in the future, how we pay for it. So for everyone following, our hashtag is Assembly Transport. To all our guests, including my committee members, please turn off your phones, not to vibrate, but to silent or off, because we can still hear the vibrate. And to any guests in the public gallery as well. For people following an audience here, since we've published the agenda, we've received a response from the Mayor in response to the committee's work on Crossrail, and that's been published, and that's now available for everyone to see on our website. Just wanted to see if there are any other declarations of interest from members. No? Thank you. Just moving on to the minutes of our last meeting on the 15th of May. Can we confirm that the minutes are as agreed and accurate?
Agreed. Yep.
Thank you. Move on to some other items. Can we note the standing delegation authority to me as chair of the committee to agree the topics and the scope of our future investigations in consultation with the party group leads, and as agreed at the plenary meeting in June? Agreed. We have a range of summary list of actions.
Shall I just flag on that the response from the FCM?
Yeah,
sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon. So we've received a number of other responses from our investigation into Crossrail, and can we delegate with authority to me in consultation with the party leads and Assembly Member Pigeon to follow up on the letter from the FCA?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. And can the committee under delegated authority in consultation with the party leads and Assembly Member Pigeon to agree to the scope of our bus and tram safety work? Agreed. Fantastic. Right, moving on to this morning's meeting, just to welcome our guests. We are waiting for one of our guests to join us. He is on his way. So we have before us Lucinda Turner, who's the Director of Strategy at TfL.
Director of Spatial Planning.
We've got you strategic planning, so spatial planning.
Spatial planning.
So correction on that.
Promoted you. You just
Take the promotion, Lucinda, don't worry. We have Simon Nielsen, who's the Head of Strategic Analysis at TfL, is that correct?
Correct.
We've got Silviya Barrett, Research Manager at Centre for London, morning, and Nicole, Research Associate for Urban Infrastructure and Policy and Governance at University of Cambridge. Fantastic. One of the things we've been looking at on the Transport Committee is the growing nature of the transport infrastructure in London, the fact that London's population continues to grow, and we want more and more people using public transport. We know that TfL does recognise the different scope of the changes, technology, how that plays. So this morning we're going to be looking at how we make sure we've got the right transport infrastructure for Londoners and people commuting. And we've got a range of questions just looking at those different areas. So I'll start off with the first section, and this is just a broad question to all of you as our guests this morning. So how do you think London's transport system will need to develop in order to keep pace with the growing population in London? I'll come to you, Lucinda.
Thank you. Clearly the growth of London poses some significant challenges for us as TfL and in terms of delivering the transport system we need. There's a whole host of kind of issues around the environment and health that we need to address, and we need to make sure that we mitigate the impacts of transport on CO2 and kind of climate change more broadly, and deliver improvements in air quality, a huge focus kind of for the Mayor. There's also the growing challenges of health. I think this generation of children in London is the first that will live live more time in chronic illness than their parents. So a huge kind of challenge for us. And active travel is one of the crucial mechanisms for delivering kind of greater levels of activity. Currently, only 1 in 5 children get the levels of exercise and kind of active travel that they need each day. So we need to make sure our transport system kind of responds to that. More widely, in terms of the nature of the population and the kind of demographics, we have an increasing population of older people. And our transport system needs to develop further in terms of delivering step-free access and solutions for people with kind of a range of mobility challenges and other challenges to make sure London is an inclusive city. In terms of the growth of London in population and the number of trips that puts on our system, I think by 2041 we're expecting at least 5 million extra trips each day that we will have to cope with on our transport system across the different modes. In order to make sure that they are as efficient as possible and we can actually cope with that, we need to shift as many people, as you said, to public transport and walking and cycling. So the Mayor's Transport Strategy set out a really clear vision and an ambition for 80% of trips to be done by public transport, walking or cycling. That's the only way we will be able to make sure that the growth in London is sustainable. There's also a whole host of challenges, as we know, which aren't linked to transport per se, but transport is a means to an end, and delivering new homes and jobs in our city to support that growth in population is absolutely critical. And transport plays a fundamental role in that. We know that housing delivery is more viable and sustainable if we can deliver it in areas that are well connected to the public transport system. We know that we need to embed walking and cycling environments from the outset. We know actually that there's a very clear relationship between density of development and good public transport and sustainable transport outcomes. So there are some win-wins, there are some real opportunities here as well as challenges. I think there was a lot of evidence done for the development of the transport strategy that considered all the kind of different swathes of challenges, including changing technology, which again offers both opportunities and challenges for us. Disruptive technology has delivered kind of many benefits for Londoners, but it also increases the challenges in terms of making us able to have a coherent and integrated transport system in the capital that doesn't have perverse incentives for people to switch back to car. So there's all sorts of the kind of those aspects. If I can hand over to Simon, perhaps to give a bit more of a flavour on some of the challenges.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, just to give a little bit more detail maybe on some of the key parameters which I think we need to take into account in the future, which I think are quite important. I mean, one of the things which London has been experiencing for a number of years now, and which is set to continue, is the growth of London and trying to cater for that growth. We have a population now of 8.9 million. New population figures were released, I think it was 2 weeks ago, which showed that London is still growing. It went up from about 8.8 to 8.9 million people.
Could you speak up a little bit, Simon? Just
Sorry.
Yeah.
So the population between 2017 and 2018, despite the sort of almost unprecedented levels of uncertainty in the economy at the moment, increased from about 8.8 to 8.9 million people, which makes it still the fastest growing region in the United Kingdom. Now we're expecting to see that increase to about 10.8 million people in 2041, which is 2 more million people. That's the equivalent of adding Glasgow and Birmingham to what is already a very large conurbation. And we also know the distribution of that growth is going to be, it's not going to be evenly spread. We're expecting something like 40% of the growth to occur in East London. And as Lucinda mentioned, we're also expecting the population to age, which is important in terms of what we need to plan for in the future. Even between 2017 and 2018, the most recent data we have on population, we saw that the population of people over 60 increased by 2% compared to a 0.9% overall increase. So you can see that starting to happen. And it's not just population, it's also jobs. So we're expecting jobs to increase by over 1 million people, 1 million jobs by 2041. And combined, this population growth combined with this employment growth is likely to result in 5 to 6 million extra journeys every day on London's transport network. And that is an enormous challenge for us to be able to cater with. And we already have crowding challenges and congestion challenges and air quality challenges and climate change challenges. But this is going to put a further burden on the system. We need to plan very effectively to do it. So that's just a little bit more flavour on the growth. And I just wanted to add a little bit more also on health, environment and safety, which I think are sort of two very important aspects of the challenge we're facing. So we know that there's over-reliance on cars, and we know that the over-reliance on cars has important consequences because it results in inactivity, and inactivity is linked to heart disease, it's linked to cancer. If everybody in London was physically active every day, it would reduce the risk of things like type 2 diabetes by 35 to 50%, breast cancer by 20%, heart disease by 20 to 35%. I could keep going. There's lots of statistics like that. So activity is very important from health point of view. So we need to increase activity through travel. And that's one of the things the MTS focuses on very, very clearly. But traffic has lots of other consequences. So, for example, traffic obviously leads to pollution, and it's a big impact on global warming as well. So we know that roads result in something like half of the main pollutants that we see in London. Cars contribute 14% of nitrogen oxides and 56% of the smaller particulate matter, which is harmful to health. So we need to reduce traffic and we need to clean up London's vehicles.
Okay.
And then, sorry.
Do you want to just finish on that?
Okay, well the third area related to this sort of general point, I think, was around road danger, because traffic also leads to road danger. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is a big reduction in people who've been killed and seriously injured on our streets. But most of that reduction has happened for people who are in cars. And much of the reason for that has been because in-vehicle safety measures have been brought in, because we've put big emphasis on 20 mile an hour, on junction schemes at accident locations. But we're now left with a sort of like a big issue for vulnerable road users. So we know, for example, that motorcyclists per kilometre travelled are 25 times more likely than average to be killed or seriously injured travelling on London's roads. So it's this, the focus now needs to move towards vulnerable road users. And we've seen the risk for cyclists, for example, reduce very significantly, but with growth in cycling, we need to continue to emphasise that. So those were that was the sort of the detail I just wanted to add to Lucinda's points.
Thank you. Assembly-Member Bailey.
First of all, you said 40% of polluted particulates come from cars. Where do the rest come from?
Well, from a wide range of other sources. So they come from other vehicles, they come from construction, they come from boilers, they come from a wide range of other things. And those things are covered in the GLA and Mayor's approach to dealing with pollutants through the London Environment Strategy.
Thank you.
Assembly-Member Prince.
Thank you. You mentioned the vulnerability of motorcyclists, and as a motorcyclist I'm fully aware of that vulnerability. What I don't see is anything being done whatsoever to help motorcyclists. In fact, quite the opposite.
I mean, it is a key feature of the Vision Zero action plan which we're developing. We're very aware that we need to have a safe system approach which takes into account behaviours and the sort of unpredictable behaviours which can sometimes happen on our roads to reduce the impact of collisions when they occur, and to make sure that all the people who have a responsibility for managing roads in London feel that they've got a responsibility for reducing road danger. So I think that's very important. But then there's 5 pillars of action which are set out in the Vision Zero action plan. The first is around safe speeds. The second is around safe streets and junctions, which I'm sure is an important issue here. Safer vehicles, and then safer behaviours, and that involves things like targeted marketing. So I think that
But none of that, sorry, with respect, none of that actually helps a motorcyclist per se. I would be interested to see if you've got
maybe we can take this up offline, okay, because we've got quite a lot to get through this morning.
On the accident figures for areas where motorcyclists are allowed to use bus lanes and where they're not allowed to use bus lanes. And that's somewhere where the Mayor just hasn't made any progress at all.
might have to come back to you on that point.
Yeah, that's fine.
If we could. Assembly Member Bacon.
No, thank you, Chair. It was on exactly that point.
Okay, great. So we'll come back on that. Just mindful that we've got quite a lot to get through. Just to welcome our additional last panel, John Dickie, who's the Director of Policy and Strategy at London First. Welcome, John. Just moving on, the other area I wanted to focus on, and maybe coming to you, Nicola, is around, and Lucinda's touched on it, the fact that, yes, London's population is growing, but also people's work-life pattern and commuting is changing as well. How do you think the transport service is going to respond to that change, where we're seeing more people doing flexible working, setting up their own businesses and not having to commute?
Yeah, so since around 2014, we've seen that travel behaviour has changed, that the average trips the average Londoner is making has gone down quite significantly. So around 2014, it was around 2.6 trips a day. We're down to 2.1. And so generally the sort of wisdom is that population growth will lead to transport demand, more transport demand, because everyone sort of had a general basic travel budget. That seems to be changing. The reasons for that are not particularly clear. Some of that has to do with the flexibility around work arrangements. We have seen that people are generally switching to more of a 4-day-a-week in the office schedule from a 5-day-a-week schedule. But of course that varies a lot between what sort of jobs people are doing. What we've seen the biggest drop in is trips for leisure and shopping. Some of that may now have been shifted, so we may see some substitution of that with more people shopping online and getting deliveries, and that is putting quite a different strain on the transport network than people going out, for instance, to Stratford, Westfield or Oxford Street, because instead of the person now going by public transport, you have freight delivery, and often they aren't successful at the first time, and so you are seeing that there are more trips being made by freight. And if you look at goods vehicles, the percentage that they are making up of the traffic mix is also going up. So I think looking ahead, what we know for certain is that most of the infrastructure we have today is also going to be there in the future. And so yes, we may get an extra tube line, we may get Crossrail 2, but overall we're still going to have the same infrastructure network that we have today. And if we are expecting growth, then we need to think really hard about how we're going to make more efficient use of the infrastructure we have today. And of course, there are competing demands on, for instance, road space. But if we want to make this growth happen and we want to enable people to get to work and have those agglomeration benefits of working nearby to other people in their profession, then we need to think about who is using the roads and maybe switch to higher capacity modes, so buses, for instance, and prioritising those. No,
that's good. John, Silviya, one of the things that we've also been looking at is the way that technology and what role that plays in transport in terms of how people use the transport system. Are there any key technological changes that you think that TfL should be looking at to respond to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think technology provides many opportunities but also many challenges in London's transports. So for example, we know that digital technology is revolutionizing the way that people move and travel around the city, enabling people to plan their journeys more easily and personalize their own journeys. But there are also new mobility services that are enabling people to maybe take other modes than they would have otherwise. So for example, ride-hailing, has enabled people to make some journeys which they might have done by public transport, by cabs, for example. But we're also seeing a shift from mobility as a product with a private car towards mobility as a service. And this is a different dynamic for people than owning your own car. In many senses, that's a very much positive development, because when people own a car, it's proven that they're more likely to use it more often. So if we move towards mobility as a service and car clubs, for example, then there's lots of evidence that this reduces people's reliability on cars and using other modes as well. But if we're not careful, then technology can produce challenges. So, for example, if it's much easier to to hail a cab, then people might be tempted to use that more frequently. So, therefore, we need to look at how can we encourage use of public transport for shorter journeys, and looking at mitigating some of the impacts of technology and reducing the impact on congestion and pollution in that sense. Micromobility is another trend, I think, that can potentially revolutionize the way we move around the city. E-bikes are already on the streets. Potentially there will be e-scooters as well to be introduced soon. And that would pose new management and regulatory challenges of how we deal with the vehicles, how do we stop them from cluttering the pavements, for example, so regulation onto where and how the vehicle can be used and parked. But also we think that, I think we need more regulation on how different road users behave towards one another, because you have the highway code, but that's obviously a very old regulation, which focuses on car users and to some extent pedestrians, but there will be many different types of road users in the in the near future that we need to consider, and putting forward regulations to how they should behave to one another.
I think the regulation is really important. I think all of us would have seen those random bikes just slap bang in the middle of the road, and if you add electric scooters to that, it could be a recipe for this disaster. John, was there anything you wanted to add on this?
Well, I think I just sort of draw on one of the points that Silviya made, which is it's just really uncertain quite what the aggregate impact of new technologies will be. We can make all kinds of forecasts about, for example, the interaction between shared vehicle use, electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, which are all trends we know are coming, but we don't quite know when, we don't quite know what the consumer response will be, and we don't quite know what that will mean for the transport infrastructure of a city. But I think the one thing we can say with some certainty, certainly which we strongly believe and reflects the views, I think, of business in London, is that the importance of sustained investment over time in mass transit will remain critical to London remaining both a competitive city but also remaining a livable city. So there are all kinds of very interesting questions around things like home working, things like shared use of cars. If you, as you rightly say, if you don't own a car, you're likely to use it less because it's more hassle to share. But of course, if you can share a car and you couldn't before, you're likely to use it more. So how all these things interact is very uncertain. But the thing that is certain is that we do need to continue to invest in the mass rapid transit infrastructure for the city.
Nicole just wanted to come, and then I'll come back to you, Lucinda.
Actually, I just wanted to reiterate something that Silviya was saying, which is that currently neither the boroughs nor Transport for London or the city government has the powers to really regulate micromobility properly. Yes. So looking at, for instance, scooters and dockless bikes, currently neither the boroughs nor Transport for London has the powers to manage them properly on the public space.
Just to add a few thoughts, thank you, Chair, that I agree absolutely with John that the importance of mass public transport and efficient modes of transport is not going to go away. Road space is inevitably limited, and cars, even if kind of autonomous cars, they still take up road space and are inherently inefficient. If they can be used in outer London in some form of sharing and switch people from owning a car, they could have kind of an important role as a complementary measure. But I think that's why the MTS set out a framework within which we were exploring technology and trying to maximise the opportunities it offered, but kind of manage some of the potential impacts. And I think we sometimes need to remember that technology is kind of great, and my goodness, I wish I had the crystal ball. I mean, the things that have changed kind of over the last 20 years that we've kind of seen, I think, are unprecedented. And that there's a team in TfL who kind of is specifically looking at this, and I think Michael Hurwitz is coming to talk to you kind of later. But actually, some of the solutions we're talking about here, and some of the most important solutions, are actually pretty low-tech. I mean, walking and cycling. But the information kind of revolution that technology can give us to help people make choices and to make those choices even kind of better. Information is becoming ever more critical in our transport offer. I think the information we've made available, I think there are 600 apps now that people can access to make use of. And I think, Simon's team have got and developed new modelling capability to try to understand and to try to be able to model scenarios with CAVs. As you say, it's inherently uncertain, but we need to try to understand some of those implications.
Yeah, no, that's good. You touched on it briefly, both you and Simon, in terms of how we make sure that transport system is resilient to climate and environmental change. But what do you think that TfL and the Mayor and Londoners and businesses should be doing to mitigate some of those risks? Is anyone, Silviya, anyone that's coming on it?
One of the main shifts that we need to see is cleaning up London's roads vehicles, as they are main contributor to both CO2 emissions and pollution. I believe so. Transport is contributes to the majority of CO2 emissions, and road transport accounts for 90% of that. And in terms of pollution, both nitrogen dioxide and PMs, the majority of those come from road transport as well. So cleaner vehicles would be very much required towards making sure that we live in more sustainable and healthier ways. Electric vehicle infrastructure is part of that, so providing incentives for people to move towards cleaner vehicles, enabling them to do that more easily. The report of the EV infrastructure task force was published recently, and that was very much welcome. I think interoperability is a key part of that, ensuring that people can very easily charge their vehicle in different technologies that are available from different operators. Another key point that we want to see there is hubs and charging hubs, but also we think that there should be wider mobility hubs, so providing access to some of those alternative solutions and mobility services that are now available, making them public spaces. But crucially, we need not only cleaner vehicles, but fewer vehicles overall. And we won't really be able to manage the challenges on our finite road space unless we have fewer vehicles. And road pricing can be a key part of delivering that.
Yeah, we'll come to that a little bit later on. Just mindful of time, and we're moving on to our second area, which is looking at the challenges facing the capital. And my colleagues, Assembly Member Copley, is going to lead on looking at housing and economic growth.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So my question is focused on how transport can support the growth in housing that we need in London. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is Crossrail 2. But in what areas does the transport infrastructure need improving to facilitate house building? Can I start with Lucinda?
I think it's important that we look both at connectivity and capacity in this regard. A lot of the potential areas for development in London are already reasonably kind of well connected. I think over half of the large site capacity is identified in PTAL kind of 4 to 6 areas. So there is connectivity there. Some of the challenges where there is a connectivity relate to actually being able to get on the transport system and capacity at stations and on the line. So clearly that's an important aspect. But I think we also need to think not only about the strategic, but about the local. We need to make places work, and we need to make places amenable to walking and cycling and those local journeys, so that people feel able to travel kind of sustainably. So it's not just access to the public transport system, but wider improvements there. A lot of development on the large sites are in opportunity areas. As I said, some of those are reasonably well connected, but actually some of them, where there are the largest opportunities for delivering large-scale housing, aren't as well connected currently. So we clearly do need to look at extending the reach of our transport system as well, and we are looking at a number of projects around that, including the Bakerloo line extension, including DLR kind of crossing to Thamesmead, all sorts of kind of projects that we know could help deliver thousands of new homes. I guess the challenge there, as ever, we come back to kind of funding. On a more localised scale, kind of my team specifically looks at supporting the delivery of housing and making sure it's actually in line with good growth principles. And we established some years ago the TfL Growth Fund, which is about £500 million, which is explicitly targeted at unlocking transport constraints on housing and regeneration. So these are schemes that under traditional transport appraisal may not necessarily always make it to the top of the priority list, because interestingly, if you deliver a new station, the impacts on existing users is negative. Their value of time is impacted negatively. We know it opens up and catalyses that kind of development. So the Growth Fund is explicitly targeted on schemes that deliver things like station improvements and enhancements, new stations even in some areas. Can you give
an example, sorry, of one of the projects?
So some of the examples are, there's Elephant and Castle. We have committed money to upgrading and expanding the capacity there because the growth in the area couldn't cope. I mean, the modelling shows that we would be having to shut gate lines pretty regularly in a few years' time if we don't deliver that. We've got White Hart Lane station. We've got a new station committed at Bean Park. We've got transformation.
Where's Bean Park?
Bean Park is out Barking Riverside kind of direction, so it's that direction. So its only new station would be on the C2C line. It wouldn't be on a kind of TfL service, it would be a C2C line. We've got Tottenham Hale station improvements linked to the significant kind of growth in that area. We also have in the Growth Fund transformational road schemes, whereby sometimes actually transport infrastructure is there. It's more, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Sometimes it's about place quality and perceived viability that impacts. So places like Catford, the impact of the roads, Wandsworth kind of gyratory, kind of schemes like that are also in the Growth Fund. So it's explicitly targeted on that.
Did the move in the South Circular, was that government funding? Because Lewisham got 20 million, I think, to move the South Circular.
So they've got 10 million from HIF, the Housing Infrastructure Fund. Yeah. The Growth Fund is looking to match fund and kind of to complete a funding package. Because the other thing that the Growth Fund is targeted on is making best use of the money by leveraging third-party contributions, so that the burden doesn't all fall on the public sector. So there are many examples. So Canada Water, for example, Surrey Quays Station, the major development happening there will be contributing a significant amount. Thameside West, there's a new station planned there linked with a new development. Again, we are leveraging funding from the developers themselves to make sure that they bear an appropriate cost. And it means that the Growth Fund goes much further. It's designed to kind of do deals and to identify those opportunities and to make the most of that. We're also been bidding for Housing Infrastructure Fund, so the Catford is one example. That's an example of the Marginal Viability Fund where boroughs bid for that money, and I think it's a maximum of 10 or 20 million from that fund. We've been working to support boroughs in that, but we've also been working with the GLA to access the forward funding, which is maximum of around 250 million, although that's a relatively soft cap. So we have put together bids that are explicitly focused on supporting growth and unlocking housing. So we have been successful, for example, in the DLR HIF bid, whereby we will get £291 million from central government to direct to extra trains on the DLR system, to new station at Thameside West, to looking at the opportunities around Poplar, to unlock the depot site there for housing by investing in Beckton depot expansion.
I've heard several complaints recently about how congested the DLR is, and it's a number of years before we get the new trains?
We are working as fast as we can to get them. We appreciate the kind of pressures in the meantime, but with the HIF bid and our business plan programme, we will have, I think it's 57 new trains being delivered there. That will deliver a 67% increase in peak capacity on the DLR, much needed but really important. And it will deliver improved cross-river connectivity, so we will have 4 trains, we'll have a train every 4 minutes from Woolwich and from Lewisham to Stratford directly, for example. So it will deliver a really significant and important boost. I know transport, we always face that. Transport investment has quite long lead times. We accept that.
I'm glad you mentioned the Bakerloo line as a Lewisham resident. You also, of course, highlighted the funding challenges. Is TfL doing any more work on land value capture? Because it seems ridiculous to me the way, for Crossrail, for example, so little money was raised from land value uplift. And I know that TfL did development rights auction model and then decided it wouldn't work in London. I know KPMG came up with a whole range of ideas for TfL, and a lot of which the government just said absolutely not. Is any more work going on in this area?
We're continuing to push. I mean, you flagged the work that we've done, so we've published 2 reports on it in the kind of past couple of years and pushed central government. It's absolutely right, though, that we need movement from central government to enable us to do it. I think it's definitely an area that we should be looking at. I mean, one of our studies showed, I think, that the estimated value uplift from a set of proposed schemes we looked at was £87 billion over 30 years, compared to a cost of around 36 billion. I mean, it's got to make sense. I guess the note of caution is there are no easy options, and particularly I'd flag that quite a lot of the value uplift arises to residential properties, so politically that's always quite difficult, but we are continuing to look at it. We are very open to trying to work with central government, but we do need changes to regulation and legislation. So we looked at stamp duty, land taxation, for example, as well, and whether the government would ring fence some of the uplift in that from areas, from a zone around the kind of transport improvements that were being delivered. As you say, they haven't moved on
I mean,
that.
our likely future Prime Minister, when he was Mayor, was a great advocate of devolving all the property taxes to London, and given his reputation for consistency and principle, I'm sure that he will set to that immediately when he gets into office. Thank you very much, Lucinda. That was very comprehensive. I think I need to move on to some of the our other guests. So perhaps if I could go to Nicole.
And any other points as well,
and any additional points on the transport infrastructure and supporting housing.
Maybe just to highlight what Lucinda was touching on as well about when we have sites that we can unlock for new housing. It's also important that we develop them with a GP, with schools nearby, so that all of those other trips, not necessarily your commute, but the other trips, can be catered for at a more local level, and then not adding to the strain of the wider network into central London. I think on options for funding some of these schemes, other cities might have some suggestions. So just yesterday, Berlin suggested that they were going to introduce a €365 annual ticket, and some of that was going to be funded by having a sort of an employee tax, so you would pay as an employer some small amount, I think it was a few euros each month, but that would contribute to obviously the budget for investing in infrastructure and employees.
It's interesting, but of course, given how congested, I don't know how congested the Berlin metro system is compared to London, but I would imagine if you did something like that here and vastly more people, then we wouldn't have the capacity necessarily, would we, on our current transport system? Would you agree?
Yes, so of course we've been talking about more generally capacity is a big issue, but I think it might encourage some of those smaller trips that you're doing, maybe more locally, especially in the outer boroughs where there's potentially a choice between getting a bus or getting into your own car, under the sort of heading of trying to get to this target of 80%. If you look at some of it, it doesn't seem to have been a big change in the last few years, and the modal split of general trips is still around 60%, 63%. It's quite an aspirational target, and I think we do need to think of more radical ways of encouraging people to use public transport as their default, or after they've considered active travel. So yeah, and I think also thinking about the connections around these new housing developments. Do we have bus routes which are taking them to where the schools might be, where the high street might be? These are important considerations so that we don't develop what I would call residential dormitories, where you're just having to leave where you are living all the time.
Thank you. Simon, do you have anything to add from the TfL perspective? I think we've got quite a comprehensive answer from
Sorry, I could
Lucinda.
talk for days on growth.
No, it's very interesting.
Just a couple of points, really, because it is Lucinda's specialist area. But I think it's just important to be aware that the whole Mayor's transport strategy is relevant to this area, because the 80% mode share target is about creating an environment where London can grow effectively without too many problem consequences. And really just to add that things like the healthy streets approach is very relevant. I think that buses, particularly in outer London, which are kind of flexible, affordable, accessible, and can be sort of scaled up and down quite rapidly, is very relevant to accommodating housing. But also at the other extreme, things like Crossrail 2 are also very important, because they can generate very large volumes of housing capacity, and we know that Crossrail 2 could support up to 200,000 extra homes, as well as increasing the capacity of the rail network and dealing with a number of problems. So I think it's a very sort of broad answer, really, I think is required to answer a specific question.
John?
Well, first, I suppose I should say how welcome it is that TfL do see their role now as not simply being a transport authority, but looking at the role their investment can play, not the sort of usual systemic things a transport authority.
And they're, of course, a developer now as well.
Exactly, yeah. and exactly right. So I think that's a very important and welcome development for the city. I think, rather as Lucinda said, the critical thing around scale housing development is going to be new infrastructure that unlocks new parts of London, because vital as, for example, the central section of Crossrail 2 is for capacity relief, it's not really going to unlock a huge amount of development, because we're dealing with a very developed part of the city already. So it is Crossrail 2, particularly in the Upper Lee Valley. It is Bakerloo Line extension. It's the ability of the DLR to unlock growth in Thamesmead for Peabody. Those are the kinds of developments that will make a big difference. And of course, with the extension of the Gospel Oak Line, we're starting to see that happen in practice. I guess I just had a couple of points. One is, of course, the importance of TfL as a developer using its own land, and I think TfL is going to provide 10,000 starts, I think, as a target. That's it's not going to solve London's housing crisis, but we need a lot of 10,000 starts to solve London's housing crisis. The importance of developing at scale in these areas is also really important. We do need much denser development than has traditionally been the approach of most boroughs most of the time. That, of course, needs to be done well. It needs to be done with concomitant social infrastructure. There is absolutely no argument for building slums of the future, but we do need to be looking to see how we deliver the most housing we can in areas, particularly areas which are going to be really well connected. One of the things we have not got quite right with Crossrail is the scale of development around Crossrail stations in outer London, for example. That neatly segues into value capture. Value capture is not only an important way of financing and funding new infrastructure, it's an equitable way of financing and funding new infrastructure, but it is not a magic bullet, and it's not a magic bullet for, exactly as Lucinda said, a great deal of the value uplift created goes to existing homeowners. And I was on the last iteration of the London Finance Commission, and there are some very enthusiastic technocrats who want to capture all this, and there are some people who run for and hold elected office who are running away from it as fast as they can. So I think if you want to see, the message I would give to the Assembly is, if you want to be pushing this, you're the right people to push it, because you're the people who will be facing the electorate and explaining how they'll pay for it.
Yes.
Well, I have been, so. But yes, I very much take your point. So you're absolutely right. It is very challenging.
We have to move on.
We have to move on, are we? Can I ask quickly about rail devolution?
Please do.
Sorry not to come to you, Silviya. Have you got anything?
It was exactly on rail devolution that I was going to talk about.
In that case, could I ask you just very quickly then about that and how that can support housing growth?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a general point, really, that we support the Mayor's cause for devolving suburban rail, especially in South London, to TfL and to the Mayor's office. We know that we published a report, which is now a couple of years old, but looking at the capacity that this would unlock. And calculations done at the time show that we can achieve that twofold increase in capacity that would be required in 2050 in South London. And not only that, it would of course unlock thousands of new homes and new jobs in the area. And South London is really the area that is very much underserved by rail and existing capacity, so we very much support that. And also the cost to devolve the control of the infrastructure on rail. We agree that this would improve efficiencies and the running of the network as well.
Thank you. And just very, very quickly, go to Lucinda. Any progress on rail devolution?
We have submitted a really compelling, I think, business case. We are feeding into the Williams rail review, which I think will be a key point in this. But we need metroisation, so we want to go beyond that kind of devolution. I mean, in terms of the London plan and housing delivery, suburban intensification is going to have to play an important role, and metroisation is fundamental, we believe, to that. But we can deliver, the business case just outlines some of the improvements that we can deliver. They are very tangible and will help us integrate that land use and transport planning even more.
I'm going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Thank you. Just moving on to some of the other issues faced in the capital, Assemblymember Russell.
Chair. Yes. Now, the Committee on Climate Change today said that it doesn't feel the government is making enough progress on transport emissions. So I'm sort of wondering what they can learn from London. Lucinda and Simon, perhaps you could just run through what TfL is doing to decarbonise transport.
Do you want me to start off? Okay, it's a very topical question, obviously, with the report overnight, which was a little bit focused on adaptability, I think, of the network. But in terms of what we're doing to try to decarbonise and clean up transport in London. So, first of all, ULEZ, and before that, its predecessor, the T-charge. So ULEZ is now in place. The next stage of our plans are the low emission zone with tighter Euro 6 standards, which will be coming into operation in 2020. And then in 2021, an expansion of ULEZ to the North and South Circular. So those are key elements of our strategy to reduce emissions and to clean up London's air. But there's plenty of other things which are going on, and to give you a flavour of them, because probably not everything that's being done, but a flavour of the ones which I'm aware of. So there's low emission bus zones, which are very effective. So we 75% of all...
Are you talking about sort of NOx and particulate matter, or are you talking about carbon emissions?
Well, I'm talking about cleaning the vehicle fleet, which has an effect on both areas.
Of course.
So that's why it sounds a little bit more general, because we've moved on from several years ago where the dieselification of the fleet to deal with carbon ended up causing an air quality crisis. We're trying to deal with everything together, and that's why I'm sort of covering these broader issues. So 75% of all TfL buses now meet or exceed the ULEZ standard. The cleanest buses, for example, are obviously in the central zone, but the routes cover the whole of London, and that creates London-wide benefits. The low emission bus zone modelling, which has been undertaken, the air quality modelling, has shown that NOx emissions have reduced by 90%. 10 of them have been introduced to date, and there's 2 more coming on stream. And for example, in places like Putney High Street and Brixton, there's been a major impact on pollution levels. There are also things going on cleaning up the taxi fleet, which is another thing which is relevant here. So phasing out diesel taxis from 2018, there's going to be no new diesel taxis licensed in London, and all new taxis are going to be zero emission capable. There's financial incentives provided, and I think something around 175 rapid charge points have been put in place, some of which are focused on the trade. And consultation underway at the moment to reduce the maximum age of some of the older diesel taxis to 12 years. So that's sort of happening, but the idea behind that is to accelerate the uptake. There's measures in place to clean up air around schools, preventing idling, encouraging walking and cycling, cleaning up air pollution hotspots in London boroughs, improving air quality alerts to help people reduce their exposure. There's information on something like 2,500 countdown sites now at bus stops, and direct emails being sent out to schools and other stakeholders. Reducing air pollution from other non-road sources, so there's non-road mobile machinery low emission zones. There's the work which we're doing on Heathrow, which is a key issue for air quality in London in terms of compliance, and also carbon as well, and then low-income scrappage scheme. So there's a very wide range of things that which are being done to address those issues.
That is a wide range of things. One of the areas is obviously electrification of vehicles, the sort of electric vehicle charging. TfL is committed to installing at least 300 rapid charging points by 2020. Do you think this is enough to convince Londoners to make that switch to electric vehicles? And if not, what else do you think needs to be done?
I think it's something which will have to continue to evolve in line with the take-up of electric vehicles, and I think we just need to monitor the take-up and try to put in more electric charging points if they are required to encourage
And
the take-up.
you don't think you should actually be trying to get people to do other things than driving cars?
Well, a crucial point is that the strategy which we have is about trying to reduce the amount of car travel. So the Mayor's transport strategy aims to reduce car travel or road traffic by 10 to 15%, which is quite a significant amount. And part of that as well is trying to get into this 80% mode share target, which is 80% of all travel in London by 2041 to be done by sustainable modes, so it's walking, cycling and it's public transport. So I think that is actually an absolutely key element of the strategy to address carbon.
I think just to add to that, as well as those 300 charging points, that will be supported by, I think, 1,100 kind of residential charging points. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there will be, kind of even with the 80% mode share kind of target, there will still be vehicle kilometres on the road. So focusing on that technology and making those as clean as possible has to be part of the answer. But more widely, it is about that mode shift we've talked about. It is about getting people out of cars and onto public transport, walking and cycling.
The Mayor's electric vehicle infrastructure delivery plan looks at how the EV infrastructure is going to be delivered, and it says with less public subsidy. So what exactly does that mean? What's TfL exploring over that?
I probably don't know. I think we might have to come back to you on some of the detail, but I know we're exploring delivering hubs, which makes it more cost efficient to deliver, and leveraging kind of partnerships as well to get other kind of people and businesses, etc., to deliver some of that charging infrastructure. But I could follow up with you in more detail.
I think the other issue is the use of the pavement for vehicle charging infrastructure, because it seems TfL should presumably have a role in protecting the public interest and the public purpose of the footway, which is for people to walk and or use wheelchairs or push buggies. And the risk is that the pavements start to become littered with infrastructure which is for the purposes of selling fuel to private car owners, and it's infrastructure that's possibly owned by companies other than TfL or the local boroughs, which potentially has problems going into the future. If you think about all those old telephone boxes around on the pavements that it's proving very difficult to get rid of in some cases, despite the fact they're no longer used. You know, what public protection is there for to make sure that the public interest is protected from all this rush to provide electric vehicle infrastructure in the boroughs.
Funny you should mention the telephone boxes. My team have had to deal with thousands of applications for the kind of Trojan horse of advertising. The government's now changed the permitted development rights on those. But I think you're right to kind of have a note of caution. It is absolutely right that the Healthy Streets approach talks about street clutter and making sure that our pavements and streets are fit for purpose. I think it's about getting the infrastructure in the right place. It's also about being a bit more imaginative, so there are kind of plenty of examples where the infrastructure is integrated into the kind of street lamps or other kind of things that are already there, which helps reduce clutter. I think that's another reason why there's a focus on hubs. So rather than just kind of sporadic kind of dotting, that there's a focus, and where possible looking at where that can be off street. So things like retail kind of car parks, for example, where there is space and it doesn't have those kind of implications. I think it's inevitably kind of a balance, as all these things are, but we do see our kind of role in making sure that balance is struck.
Okay, so there is definitely
an awareness
of that and protecting the interests of pedestrians. Thank you. Yes, what about the electricity that's being used by TfL to power the network in the first place? So the electricity that's used to power the trains and buses. It's, I believe, TfL's currently about 0.01% renewable electricity, which isn't great. Do you know what's being done to move that on?
I know that it's certainly part of the strategy to improve that. If I may, I don't know the detail of that.
Could you come back to us on that, please?
Yes, I will,
that would
certainly.
That would be very useful. Then we've covered quite a lot on the ULEZ already, but what support is needed from central government to further improve London's air quality?
Probably the main area is around, if we move into vehicle scrappage, I think it's around supporting that kind of thing, because that really does need to be a national-led scheme. I think also central government needs to recognise that these costs can't all be borne by regional or local authorities. So I think it's probably around those two areas, really. It is important that central government supports these areas.
Does anyone else have? Yes.
Can I add on that? We very much support the scrappage scheme that the Mayor introduced in the beginning of the ULEZ. I know there's one for low-income Londoners as well that has not started yet, and we're looking forward to getting some more details on that. But yes, the role of central government in funding vehicle scrappage, I think, would be important, because, say, other cities receive funding that London does not. For example, the Clean Air Zone implementation funding, innovative city funding, various other pots of money that London has no access to. So that would be a big area to look into. But there are things that we can do much more locally at the London level and the local authority level. So, for example, a lot of good work happening in terms of training and supporting businesses, for example, to move to cleaner vehicles such as cargo bikes. Local support is very valuable there. Subsidized bike hire is another way to get people to shift to different modes that may not otherwise be able to, or thinking about it. But subsidies and grants for electric vehicles more generally, I think, play a big role, and again, deferring to central government at that point.
I'd probably add more widely. I always think of kind of beyond transport, planning system, the right kind of and supportive planning policies in place via kind of MPPF and others to allow kind of London and kind of its London plan and kind of boroughs to deliver development in line with good growth. So things around maximum parking standards, kind of all sorts of kind of aspects there that we don't often kind of always kind of think about when we think about transport, but that wider planning framework and policy is crucial.
Can I just emphasise the resourcing point before we finish this bit, which I think Simon touched on? It is, of course, right that we need a proper national scheme around scrappage. This is particularly an issue for smaller businesses who are reliant on the diesel vans they were incentivised to buy to save the planet a few years ago, which, of course, are now killing everybody. having a proper scrappage scheme in place that gives them the right incentives is really important. But I think the other thing is the resourcing that TfL has as an operator. If we're going to have zero emission buses across the whole of London, TfL is going to have to pay a substantial amount to get those zero emission buses across the whole of London, and it doesn't really have the money to do that now, given the current levels of bus subsidy and the general state of TfL's income. So I think we do need to think, as with so many other things, quite how we get ourselves in a position where TfL has the resources, both in operating and investment terms, to deliver the services that we need over time.
We're going to come to that section a bit later on, John.
Right idea.
Thank you.
Okay, I was just going to say, though, are you thinking there about road pricing, or are you thinking about VED being devolved?
So I think there's a whole range of ways you could give TfL more resources. There are things it can do around, we see with ULEZ, that generates some resource. Extending the congestion charging zone, which we would support, would generate more resource to modernising the congestion charging zone. So having a system whereby you don't just pay once to come in and drive around all day, but you pay per kilometre travelled and so forth. So there are things that could be done already by TfL. There are transport-specific, if you like, bits of central government revenue, so vehicle excise duty, which could be devolved. There are other things which could be devolved, but I'm fairly relaxed, as it were, about quite what particular devolution or charging package we introduce to give TfL greater resources. The importance is that those greater resources come.
Thank you. And then finally, just going back to the Mayor's Healthy Streets approach, which obviously is aiming to take a public health approach to transport planning. Looking forward, are there things in particular that Transport for London should be building on? And Nicole, I was wondering if you could start us off.
Okay. Also, what TfL should be building on?
In order to move Healthy Streets forward, it's like we've got, we have a Healthy Streets approach. When new junction designs come out, they come along with a Healthy Streets spider diagram. But what's, in order that Healthy Streets is properly embedded, what are the things that really need to be pushed forward on Healthy Streets to help with this overall agenda of reducing carbon emissions, cleaning up the air, and keeping our city functional, in that the transport system isn't just grinding to a halt.
Yeah, so I guess I would think instrumental to achieving healthy streets and achieving the 80% target is shifting away from private transport on our roads, so freeing up space to make some of these places rather than locations of movement. I think also, of course, having funding is important, so that funding can be given to the local boroughs to improve their streets. I think road pricing is a good way of reducing demand for private vehicle usage in the city. And another thing would be around freight consolidation. Consolidation isn't really something that makes financial sense for the companies themselves, so that might be something that really has to be city-led. Having consolidation centres dotted around the city. One idea might be to do something like a franchising arrangement where one distributor or one delivery company bids to operate in a certain borough or in a certain part of the city. So instead of there being a lot of duplication with a lot of different delivery vans going out, and as I mentioned earlier, often they are not successful in the first instance, that would be consolidated into one. I think looking on the streets, we also need to think of a loading bay strategy. So often a lot of the delays on the bus network are because people are parking in the bus lane or the bus stops. So I think what we need is a very holistic view on how we're going to achieve that. Healthy streets and places and good public transport is sort of the goal, but we need concrete actions now. It's very well articulated, this goal, in the Mayor's transport strategy. What maybe now needs to follow, and more rapidly than is already in place, are actions and more radical actions to make that happen.
Just a few thoughts to add. I mean, we are spending £2.3 billion on healthy streets over the course of our business plan. We take it very seriously. The centrality of health in our planning is definitely kind of has increased. And we've recently, I think the consultation on 20 mile an hour zones, for example, is just coming to a close. Significant proportion of people are telling us that could help them, encourage them to cycle and walk more. Our cycle action plan indicated the two biggest deterrents are around safety and too much traffic. So we clearly need to tackle those issues. If we look at all car trips at the moment, 50% of all car trips across London could be cycled in 10 minutes. There is huge potential here. Just in terms of something very close to my heart, new development, that we have issued new guidance on transport assessments for new developments with a much stronger focus on healthy streets and ensuring that they assess not only access to public transport, I mentioned, but active travel zones, and they look at how they integrate their developments into the cycle and walk networks. So there's kind of very specific stuff happening on the ground there, and we have been out and offered training to both consultants and boroughs across London to help support them in delivering those new aspects of it. So I think there are some very kind of tangible things we are doing.
Sylvia, did you want to add anything on that?
Not particularly. I think the focus on public realm, quality public realm and attractive places, I think it's important as well to make people want to spend more time outdoors, as well as the safety aspect and less clutter from cars and vehicles.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just mindful of time, we've still got 3 more sections. If we could be quite succinct and short in our replies and questions, members. Moving on to section 3, which is looking at people's experience of moving around the capital. Assembly Member Curtin.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, good morning, everyone. So I just want to ask you a few questions about people's experiences of moving around the capital and how you see that changing in the future. And my first question is about, what do you think in the coming years are going to be the big changes in how people move around the city? And I know you've already said in your answers a little bit about modal shift and the Mayor's target of 80% public transport, walking and cycling by 2041. But I don't know if you've got anything more to say about that hasn't been covered, but particularly thinking about the differences between inner London and outer London, because sometimes there's a very big difference between life in different parts of the city. So if you've got anything to say about that, then please do.
I would just reiterate the point Silviya made earlier, that with new tech becoming available, if you think of the ride-hailing apps, if we don't manage that in a way, because it's the ease of it and the pricing that they've come in under the taxis, and often if you're travelling with 1 or 2 people, or 2 or 3 people, very competitive to public transport, that will take off, and there will be more of them, and we've seen that in the last few years on our streets. And obviously that's not the most efficient use of public road space. I think generally tech can be very disruptive. So if we think ahead at the potential of connected autonomous vehicles, again we need to think ahead, and government needs to think ahead of how we're going to regulate that, so that it does sort of align with the wider aspiration, the wider vision for the city of how we get around. I think looking at outer London, there is potential and the opportunity where demand responsive transport might be a good service to feed into the public transport system. Also an opportunity to provide good access for people with mobility challenges. We will have an ageing community in London. So I guess summary would be that tech presents opportunities but also challenges, and government needs to be agile enough to respond to them with regulation.
Yeah.
I think those differences between inner and outer London, kind of, we do recognise that. I know some people think we are sometimes kind of central London focused, etc. But clearly there are differences. But I would say also that outer London is far from homogenous, and there are significant kind of differences in potential there. I mean, if you look at Hillingdon, even 58% of the car trips there by Hillingdon residents could be cycled under our kind of analysis, which already takes account of encumbrance and other factors. But kind of the London plan, other policies do recognise that the context is rather different. And I think some of the changes we'll also see are around our bus network. So we are looking to invest and increase the kilometrage in outer London, but also modernise the offer. So we are looking at things like more express services, kind of more modern kind of buses. So we will have 6 wholly new bus routes starting in outer London over the next 6 months. Kidbrooke, the X180, Harrow to Heathrow, 278, which is Ruislip to Heathrow, and a number of others. They are wholly kind of new routes. And my colleague here mentioned demand responsive transport. We've launched the trial in Sutton, for example, looking at how that might play a role. So that will help our understanding in terms of, will it be able to provide better alternatives to those in outer London who are more car dependent, and we have to recognise that there are fewer alternatives for some of those journeys at the moment. Will that be able to provide a kind of a really good complement to the traditional bus network? And we're due to launch a trial in Ealing as well. So I think there are all sorts of things that will be changing over the coming years.
Okay, thanks. So sticking with, sorry,
could I just add a couple of points if I may? One is to just, I'm a bit like a broken record, Chair, but I will reiterate, in outer London where densities are less and average costs are higher, and actually cars are relatively more efficient for journeys than they are in central London, if we are going to affect modal shift, again we return to the need for investment in new services to support that, particularly if we're going to do innovative demand-related things around the last mile to get people to and from transit nodes. I just wanted to make a sort of slightly different point on some of the innovation and tech that's affecting the way people travel in the city. It is, of course, right that we do need to have the capacity of city government to regulate innovation, and we need to be agile and forward-thinking, which TfL has not always been in quite how it approaches that regulation. But we do also need to remember the extraordinary benefits this brings, and we are too quick, I think, often to think of the disbenefits, which there are and which do need to be managed, but to think how, I teenage children, and Uber has transformed their ability safely to get around the city at night when they return from the sorts of parties teenage children go to. And this is, of course, an experience that I imagine most of us have had in using ride-hailing apps over the past few years. So we absolutely need to think about the holistic impacts on the city, and we do need proper oversight and regulation. But equally, we do need to remember how a lot of these changes are making a lot of people's lives a lot better.
If I could just have one point. Just going back to what we were talking about earlier about scrappage schemes, and I was thinking that it might be good if some of these schemes would also offer the option to trade in your car for an e-bike, which might be a good solution for last and first mile, and a way to encourage mode shift, and also the challenge of how do you get from the tube station or the bus stop late at night in a less densely residential area.
A couple of points to add here, if I may. On the scrappage point, again, what we suggested in our recent report was that we provide mobility credits that can be used across a wide range of services, including public transport, bike hire, car clubs, whatever the person chooses, as opposed to purchasing a new vehicle. So that provides a much wider choice of options that people would have then in how they move around the city. And related to that, on John's point about mobility services, we have a proliferation of private sector apps, of course. If we had the TfL alternative that provides a multimodal journey planning services that integrates public transport, private car hire, car clubs, bike hire, from a variety of operators, then that would make things much easier for customers and provide and perhaps incentivize the greater usage of those options. And it would be able to compare the impacts of that journey as well as the costs. So, for example, you'd be able to see journey times, compare journey times, journey costs, but also perhaps the emission impacts that you might be able to make or not make by having a certain choice of mode. So perhaps there's a role for TfL there as well.
Thanks. Another question, sort of following on from some of your answers. Now, buses obviously are a very important way for people to travel around, particularly in outer London. But bus usage is falling at the moment. I mean, what do you think is the reason for that, and how should TfL respond to that? Maybe I can ask TfL to start with.
To start. It's a really interesting question, something which obviously we're doing a lot of thinking about at the moment. Bus increased very rapidly in the 2000s, very rapidly. The expansion of the network resulted in a very large increase in ridership. But over the last 2 or 3 years, bus ridership has been reducing. We also saw a sort of flattening of underground demand more recently. There may now be a return to growth on the underground, but there are a divergence between those two modes of travel, which our analysis suggests that there are different sets of drivers affecting the demand in those areas. So we think, for example, the underground demand is affected by central London employment, and we know from our other work that employment in London has continued to grow, jobs have continued to increase, but also things like tourism and spending in higher income households affect the underground, whereas bus demand tends to be affected by employment not just in central London but more spread across greater London. And it's also affected by consumer spending in lower income households. And we know that there has been a squeeze on incomes with the uncertainty in the economy. We know that housing prices are high at the moment. So we think those are the kinds of things which affect bus versus underground demand. We also know that National Rail has been growing quite substantially. So in 2018, we saw something like a 4.5% increase in National Rail in London and the South East area. That obviously has a little bit of a knock-on effect onto the underground as well, but was partly because of the massive amount of disruption that took place the year before. So it's a bit of a rebound effect as well. But we are carefully monitoring these trends, and it's definitely linked to the uncertainty in the economy.
Okay.
Just to add to that, we have also had challenges with regard to bus speeds and congestion, and that goes back to needing kind of that mode shift to enable us to manage the network efficiently and help those essential journeys kind of by freight and servicing on kind of buses. But we're also working closely with the boroughs to try to deliver enhanced bus priority, to try to tackle that and ensure that bus users can have those reliable journeys and kind of with good journey times.
Okay.
I've had a few members that indicated, Assembly Member Shard and Assembly Member Baker.
Got another couple. Shall
Right. Yeah.
Section first. Okay, right. What journeys in London are particularly challenging for people to make? And also, are there any particular places that you think are really bad for people to travel between that need improvement?
Well, I think in the context of our strategy, which is trying to move people onto walking, cycling and public transport, then I think the challenge is quite firmly or squarely placed around outer London, where the density of public transport networks is not the same as in London. The question I believe you asked a minute ago about the differences between different areas, that's very apparent in terms of the density of public transport, and I think that is one of the key features really from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean you mentioned obviously in the plan it is to reduce the number of people driving cars and taking private vehicles, but you need to offer choice for people to do that, and I think you've mentioned that a little bit, John, and others of you have mentioned that. But are there any specific transport projects that TfL has that you think you need to prioritise in order to make that happen to reach your targets?
I think it's just worth reiterating a point which Lucinda made earlier, which is about the opportunity to mode shift, which isn't necessarily entirely dependent on public transport density and availability. And I think, Lucinda, you mentioned earlier the figure of 70% of car trips by London residents could potentially and realistically be walked, cycled or taken by public transport. And if you break that down, you find that more than half of car trips could be cycled in less than 10 minutes. You find that more than a third could be walked in less than 25 minutes. And this kind of demonstrates this huge potential for mode shift which is there. And some of that is not dependent on public transport services, but on walking, cycling, active travel.
So are you sort of talking about car journeys which have below a certain length? Are you talking sort of like below 2 miles or something? Is that sort of your criteria for making that
well,
sort of statement?
we look at all car trips, but we then try to look at the switchability of those car trips by trying to work out whether the journey was made carrying luggage or equipment or in large groups or late at night. And we have something called the switchable trips analysis, which enables us to make these assertions and to calculate these sorts of figures.
I mean, the length is clearly kind of an issue in that, but if you look at just car trips in outer London, over a third of those are less than 2 kilometres. So there is kind of significant potential here.
And we are aiming in the strategy to get 70% of people living within 400 metres from the London cycle network, for example. These sorts of things can have a very big impact.
When you talk about modal shift in terms of percentages, I mean, is that to some extent irrelevant? Because what's really important is the total number of vehicle journeys that are made. I mean, you've got an increasing population, so there'll be more journeys made in total. You know, if you're talking about London's population increasing from 9 million to 11 million approximately. So, I mean, what you mentioned modal shift, and I mean, sort of taking the number of private car journeys down to about 20%. I mean, you say 80% public transport, cycling, walking. That means 20% with other modes of travel. But I mean, what is that in absolute numbers of journeys? Because if you reduce the percentage, but the actual total numbers of journeys by those modes doesn't change, then you're not going to relieve congestion. You're not going to reduce the absolute number. I mean, so what are your sort of figures in terms of absolute numbers of car journeys or journeys which aren't public and walking and cycling?
So when we produced the Mayor's Transport Strategy, we did produce an extensive evidence base where that information is. I can't give you the specific numbers right now, but just to sort of give you some comfort that the sort of figures that were coming out of that in terms of traffic, which is one of the key focuses of the strategy because of the climate change, air quality, safety, health aspects of it, with the full strategy in place, traffic reduced by 10 to 15%, and that's something which is being considered and tracked as part of the strategy. So clearly there's an increase in cycling, we need to accommodate that, we want to accommodate that because of active travel, an increase in walking for the same reasons, an increase in public transport because that also has active travel benefits, because for every public transport trip there's often a journey to the stop and a journey back from the stop. It creates active travel and it's a much more efficient way of travelling. So we want to accommodate that, but we don't want to accommodate the car travel, and that's why we have a target of 10 to 15% reduction in traffic. So it's a really good point to make, actually. It's not just about percentages, which is what we say all the time.
Yeah.
It is about absolutes, and in planning for a city, you need to plan on the basis of those absolutes. My team is responsible for building multimodal models of London and forecasting what those demands are in the future. So all of the work we do actually has the absolute numbers in it, and we are planning and looking at the crowding impacts using those absolute numbers. But for the strategy, it's sometimes easier to talk about the percentages.
But it hits the nail on the head as to why it is even more of a challenge in a growing city.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, well, thank you.
Assembly Member Shaw.
Thank you, Chair. This is comment to our TfL colleagues on the panel. I am deeply disappointed that TfL has no plans to undertake route and branch a review of Outer London bus network in the way that Central London review was carried out only recently. I mean, given the unprecedented level of development that there is in Outer London, and there's going to be for years to come, there is no justification whatsoever that strategic approach is not taken by TfL. Would you like to comment on this, please?
Yes, I can comment on that. I think the absence of a complete route and branch across outer London as a totality doesn't mean there isn't strategic reviews going on. What we are doing is taking areas that are tractable and that make sense in journey kind of patterns in terms of the kind of catchment area to town centres, etc. And we have committed to doing a series of those reviews. And I think we've started in Croydon and Brent and a few other places, and we're committing to doing more. My team also works on opportunity areas and master planning those, and bus strategies are a core element of that. So Old Oak Common, for example, or Wembley, we have developed a bus strategy, and we are also securing contributions from the development in that area to kind of pay for those bus enhancements. So there is strategic work going on, and we are committed to continuing that.
Well, I see where you're coming from, but I'm still not convinced that the key linkages, and in terms of people's movement, which is not quite what it should be within outer London areas, that is not being taken place in a strategic, comprehensive manner, something that needs to be developed. Because you mentioned Old Oak Common, you mentioned Wembley, then you got opportunity areas in for example, say, Harrow, and then you got Barnet, you got Brent Cross and so on. Now those linkages are very important. Talking about other social infrastructure in terms of connectivity with hospitals, high streets and so on. Now those are not easy, they're complex at normal times. When you're looking at large developments, that is where I believe that that sense of strategic planning for outer London is lacking. I've picked this up with Deputy Mayor for TfL. I'm not convinced that you still are looking at it in a way that needs to be, and I'd leave it at that because this is unsatisfactory in my view. Thank you.
Pigeon, just quickly on that.
Just picking up, because we were promised as a committee, we had a briefing on the central London bus changes, and we were then promised a strategic borough by borough outer London bus review. When I met the Deputy Mayor last week, I was almost told that that wasn't ever in the plan. Well, we were told by Gareth Powell, who is in charge of this, that was what was going to happen, and we were happy about that. And our report now 2 years ago about reviewing how you do bus planning and trying a new approach based on evidence from people like Nicole was to feed into that, and it seems you're sort of rowing back on that now.
I think we're committed to area planning. I think we didn't necessarily say borough by borough because it doesn't, the network doesn't necessarily marry absolutely to borough boundaries, but we have been looking at Croydon and other places. But should I can take that back and
we'll
get somebody to follow up.
It's very clearly be borough by borough, though we accept buses go beyond borough boundaries, but that's how you're going to engage local politicians and the communities.
We will follow up on that.
Thank you. Assembly-Member Bacon.
Thank you very much, Chair. A couple of quick points. Firstly, the stats around bus usage falling. Where is it falling? Do you have that data?
Not with me, I'm afraid, but we can provide that.
Fine, because the reason for the question, well, it's obvious really. Central London is very congested and journey times are very slow. Outer London, however, feeding into the points other members have made, there's considerable scope actually to increase the bus service in Outer London. And if you're looking at displacing some from central to outer, I think that would be a bit of a winner. So perhaps if you write back to us afterwards with that information, that would be very useful. The second point was picking up something that Lucinda said a moment ago about 1/3 of all car trips being 2 kilometres or less. And I think Simon mentioned earlier on that you do also, when you're doing your mapping, your modelling, that you look at the reason for the journey. Is that right? And within that statistic you've given us about 1/3 of journeys being less than 2 kilometres, is that a factor that you feature in? Because the reason I'm asking, for example, I represent an Outer London constituency, and in Outer London people tend to do a weekly family shop at a big supermarket. That's impossible to do on a bike. It's not even worth talking about, it can't be done. And it's not easy to do on a bus either, because you have lots of shopping bags and whatever. So people in that circumstance would use their car. because there are very few public transport options in the constituency that I represent. So does that feature in the analysis that you do?
The switchable trips analysis takes account of kind of encumbrance, whether you're carrying things, the type of journey, etc. The third that I quoted, less than 2 kilometres, was purely on the basis of distance.
Okay.
The other figures that have been used have been about the switchable trips. I think interestingly, kind of nearly 50% of outer London shopping trips are already by kind of people walking and cycling. So it depends. Clearly there are choices, and clearly it varies by context and everything else, but there is still a significant proportion of people who do make those trips by walking and cycling. And I think for town centre vitality, it's an interesting angle that the work that's being done by TfL and Matthew Carmona at UCL has shown that over the course of a month, the average spend in town centres of those arriving by walking, cycling or public transport is actually 40% higher than by those travelling by car, which is an interesting kind of
Do you look at topography as well in making your assessments? Because again, outer London, particularly my constituency, is extremely hilly. And you know, when I was a teenager, when I used to have to go and have orthodontic treatment in Beckenham, my family lived in Sidcup, I would frequently cycle there. It's about 10 miles. The hills are absolutely monstrous, but in those days I was young and fit, and I used to see them as a challenge. Now, I can tell you right now, the outcome will be slightly different. And of course, the other thing about outer London is that often you get non-transient population. So you get older people, lots more retired people, but you get people with young families. And public transport is useful if you're coming into central London because you've got the radial option, but you don't really have, sorry, you have the spoke, I've used the wrong word. It's good at getting straight in, but you can't get round.
Yeah, so radial into. Yeah, and the orbital is more difficult.
Yeah, orbital is the word I was searching for. So again, I mean, if I wanted to go from Bexley Village, which is in the middle of my constituency, to Orpington, which is a journey of less than 6 miles, if I were to drive it, it would take me 12 minutes. If I were to try to do it by public transport, it would either be 2 buses and take me an hour, or I'd have to get the train into central London and back out again. And that's the only options we've got. It's either bus, train, or drive.
So I think that's right. That's why I said clearly outer London is not homogenous. There are different factors, different contexts that we need to be cognizant of. And even with the 80% kind of mode share target, that still leaves kind of journeys that will inevitably be done by kind of private car. We do recognise that not all journeys can be switched. I think there are more that can be switched than we sometimes kind of recognise though. And there are a significant percentage of journeys that can be switched from private car in outer London to public transport without a time penalty. People may not be aware of them. They may kind of be in a particular segment of the population that doesn't particularly want to take public transport, but there is still some potential kind of even in areas where we think it's quite difficult. But I do recognise that there are differences across, and our transport planning and kind of modelling does try to take as much account of those as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just mindful of time, we're going to move on to the next section on this, moving about Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up the experience of using the transport network, and I'm going to come to TfL right at the end. I really want to hear from our other guests to get their views. What do you think would really improve people's experience of moving around the capital? What things need to be done? John?
Gosh, well, I think the thing, given the conversation we just had, that sort of springs first to mind is basically making buses work in the central zone of the city. There are very few. I go spend my entire life going around the central activity zone, and there are very few times I would think getting on a bus was a rational decision. Yes, so I walk or I use the tube, but I don't use the buses. So I think making the network work for the centre would be good, and of course that would have very substantial implications for those people coming from outer London into the centre on the bus doing a sort of a long journey. In terms of the quality of journeys, I think there are 2 or 3 big things that could be done. Big thing one is, of course, air conditioning on those parts of the underground which don't have it. Anybody who came in on the Northern Line this morning will know exactly what I mean. Secondly, I think the obvious point is one we've touched on before in terms of the quality of journey, which is capacity. So it is seldom the case these days that you get on, say, the Northern Line pretty much at any time of the day, and it is quiet, but it is often almost impossible to get on the Northern Line in some Zone 2 or even Zone 3 stations on either end of the line, and that is a pretty poor way to start your day, or indeed to finish your day, but certainly to start it. And then, similarly, interchange, anybody tries to change on the Northern Line at Euston Station onto the Victoria Line knows the meaning of pain. So I think capacity is a really important part of improving people's quality of journey. I think a third thing I'd add to that is improving, let's call it connectivity on the underground. So I think digital access, there are understandable and different views about people being able to talk on the phone on the underground, though in my experience in other cities where it happens, it's actually not terribly intrusive and doesn't really cause a problem. But the ability to have data would be fantastic. And of course it ties in with the earlier discussion about being able to actually check your journey as you're going. Is kind of helpful, because I'm sure we've all found ourselves in a situation where that interchange you were going to make isn't quite going to plan. And of course, how do you know? So those are the ones that spring to mind. And I think the other one I would sort of touch on, which is the point that Silviya made earlier about greater synthesis of modal options. And I'm not sure this has to be provided by TfL. I think TfL being a wayfarer is great, but I think equally that TfL deserve credit for the amount of data they put into the public domain that allows innovation and others to come up with. You can pick and choose whether you like Google Maps to tell you how to get to B, whether you like City Mapper, whether you like Journey Planner. You can compare and contrast the often strangely different routes they suggest you take, and I think that's great for choice. So I think being able to use data, being able to access when actually travelling, but also having greater choice on apps that synthesize different data sets would be really powerful too.
Very helpful. Thank you, Silviya.
I absolutely agree with that point. So being able to make a seamless journey plan, amend your planning as you're going along, and paying for that journey in a single platform would be really valuable for many customers. I do think there's a value to having a TfL planner in that way that integrates other operators precisely for the point of updating that journey as you go along and being able to pay in a single platform for all the different modes that you might choose, because few people among us are just tube users or just cyclists or just drivers. Many people choose to mix and match many modes as they go along, so having that sort of seamless transition between modes will be really valuable. Another point I want to make is about accessibility and improving access to tube stations, to public transport. There's still a long way to go, and thinking about people with different mobility needs, impairments, disabled people, there's a lot that can be done, not only on public transport, but also providing some integrated solutions. So the taxi card platform, the different subsidies and incentives that people have, or discounts attached to certain underprivileged groups, can do with sort of more integration and thinking about in more consistent ways. And we've got a project now on transport and equity, thinking exactly about how we can integrate and improve the offer to those underprivileged groups.
It's interesting, the single platform point, because Oyster kind of is that, and now contactless cards, but actually the new on-demand bus trial in Sutton, you pay £3.50 and have to give your bank card. It's not seamless. I can't use my travel card on it. So, it's an interesting point, because it might put people off using it if it's not part of one's package. Nicole, what's your thoughts?
The docked bike share also is not available on your Oyster card, so that's also something that would be good. I want to echo most of the points that my colleagues have made, but I would like to focus on buses. And I think there is quite a large correlation between bus speeds going down and bus usage on those routes going down. The data I've seen from last year would suggest that. And I think this is a huge lost opportunity. Buses present an easy way of improving connectivity and routes and capacity relief from the tube for central London. I think we may need to rethink the cut or the short routing of some of the buses in central London. A lot of them no longer come into central London. In particular, for the transport equity terms, this is not good for people on low incomes who are reliant on buses to travel quite long distances. So what I think we need to do is really revamp bus priority and look at bus frequency, which has been affected by congestion and slower bus speeds, because you need more buses to run the same frequency if those buses take longer to take the route. It also has been affecting journey reliability and journey times. And I think it's important to make buses competitive to other routes. So you may have seen people who can afford to switch to London Underground because there's just higher journey reliability and quicker journey times. But of course, those who can't afford to do so, or those who are living in areas where there isn't a rail-based alternative, are stuck with buses which are running slower and less reliably, and also less frequently. I think interchanging and interchanges, transport interchanges, multiple and multimodal ones, are important to focus on to provide greater connectivity, because of course if you can then easily connect at any station, there are many more places you can go to much more easily. There was some new research out from UCL just 2 weeks ago on mental health and travel, and 25% of people have a mental health condition, 18% have one but is probably not registered, and that's a large percent, nearly half of people have them, and anxiety is related to travel. So just to pick out one issue, the availability of toilets. So thinking of Crossrail, for example, which will be travelling quite long distances if you travel a large part of that route, and people will not have access to toilets. This is important for people who are aging, people, women in particular, and also those who have anxiety because of that. I think the availability of staff to help is an important one, especially at interchanges, but also throughout the network for those who are new to the system, those who have problems with their card, with their bank card not working, or just need a guiding hand on where to go. Yeah, I think, air conditioning capacity, these are all big issues, but I just wanted to add those few to the discussion so far.
Thank you.
Great. Just wanted to welcome our audience. Students from Dorothy Barley Junior Academy from Barking and Dagenham. Hello, how are you? This is the Transport Committee, so we're looking at how people get around London. From Barking and Dagenham, I'm sure you had a nice journey coming into London Bridge to City Hall, so welcome.
Fantastic. So what I wanted to ask now, perhaps I can go back to you, John, is what changes you think, if any, need to be made to fares and ticketing to better reflect how people use the transport system, and can we use fares to try and deal with that overcrowding at peak times to try and shift people?
So I think the answer to that last specific question is there is more that could be done on the use of fares than TfL currently does, but it is quite difficult to see in practice how you would make a dramatic change. So if you have to be in work at 9 o'clock, you have to be in work at 9 o'clock, and we can make you pay a greater share of the cost of using the transport network than somebody who doesn't have to be in work at a set time or has a bit more flexibility. But you're not going to price that many people off the network other than really at the margin. Now that does matter, and there is more that could be done, but I don't think it is likely to be a game changer in terms of the pressures we face around capacity in aggregate. So more to be done, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Are there any other things that you think need to change in terms of fares and ticketing to reflect businesses you represent, modern day working and life?
Well, I suppose the other thing on fares, fares and ticketing, is around season tickets and the nature of the pattern people have. So it is a while since I thought it wise to invest in a season ticket. I know plenty of people in the same position, and I wonder whether well, I think there are sort of twin challenges for TfL really around this. One is whether the sort of model that we are used to around the discount you get for buying a season ticket, which favours those people who do routinely 5 days a week traipse in and out of their work, but also of course favours those people who are able to afford to pay it, and doesn't really quite give the kind of cash up front benefits in a world of 1 or 2% interest rates that it used to, whether that's really still fit for purpose, both from the demand side and actually from the supply side. And while we're on this, I do think we could do well to really question from a whole range of perspectives whether the range of concessions offered on TfL remains truly fit for purpose. I've never really understood the transport logic of giving people who are 60 and 2 months a free journey into work, because that's what people who are 60 and 2 months old going onto the network at 8:30. We've had our discussions about the quality of that journey experience. That's what they're going to do. Quite why we give it to them for free and make other people in different ways pay for it, I'm not certain about. There are a range of issues about quite how we run children and buses and school and fares, which get you into a whole range of interesting transport policy questions, but also things like public health questions. Perhaps we ought to be encouraging children to walk to school rather than giving them free bus fares and so forth. So I think that's an area in a time of straitened circumstance we might look at. Not necessarily simply to reduce it. There are good arguments around things like, for example, job seekers and giving people the ability to get to interviews. So I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have concessions. I just wonder whether, I think it's about 300 million is the cost of concessions now on the network, whether that's optimally targeted.
I think it's about 330.
Brave politician who tries to get rid of things like the 60-plus card now.
That's what we need at this hour.
That's what you need, a brave politician who's going to do that. Well, that's for next year's elections. Silviya, do you want to come in on this, your fares, ticketing and so on?
I don't have much to add on this. I think, looking at concessions will be part of our project on equity, so I think, that would be an important issue to consider.
Nicole?
On the point around the 60-plus pass, I think the costs of providing that are going to escalate quickly. We have an ageing population, and also some of the figures I've looked at suggest that around 85% of those 60-plus pass holders are using it to travel to work. In particular the male population. So I think there are questions around, is this really targeting the right people and achieving what it set out to do? So of course with those who retired, the idea behind giving them free public transport access is that will help encourage them to be part of the community, get them out, and also discourage car use. I think the bracket just below that, 60 plus, is maybe still going to work, and maybe it's not the most it's not correctly targeted there. I think on the student pass, the free pupil passes, I think they might be good to keep because it will encourage people not to use the car to get to work and those who are independent. What I'd also like to pick up on is fare capping. So the audience may be aware that, of course, if you use your bank card or even now your Oyster card, that can give you a daily and a weekly and even a monthly cap. I think moving towards also offering a yearly season cap would be a way of overcoming the challenge that those who can't pay the upfront cost of a season pass can also reap the benefits, and it also avoids having to make that decision at the beginning of the year. Will I be travelling? If you're changing your job or you're changing the location of that job, you may not be able to anticipate that, and the benefits again are only to those who are in the position to anticipate that and have the upfront costs. And then just looking at other cities, as I mentioned, Berlin, but also Vienna and the trailblazer there, who offered a season ticket of only €365, so that's only €1 a day to use public transport, and has really encouraged people to take up public transport, encouraged people to buy a season ticket, even if they're not using public transport that much. In particular, seen increases on the night public transport offered to residents in the city. So that thinking of how radical the steps need to be to get to this 80% goal, this might be something to do around fares.
I think the annualised cap is really important actually, and to have it available on Oyster as well, because not everyone wants to use their bank card, but I think it is important to start recognising people work annualised hours, term times only, 2 days 1 week, 3 the next. People need the ticketing possibly needs to reflect that. Is that something, Lucinda, quickly, TfL's looking at?
I have to say I don't know. I will come back to you on that.
Shashi, I'm sure, can answer that. I'm going to leave that section there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just moving along, we'll bring forward section 5. So we're looking at how we pay for all of these improvements we'd like to see. Assembly Member Bacon.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, there's been lots of talk about how London's roads should be funded. So I think I'll throw it open to all of you, but I'll probably leave TfL colleagues to the end because you'll be the ones making the decisions, apart from there, of course. Don't know who wants to start on this. Silviya, would you like to start?
Of course. So we recently published a report on road user charging or road pricing in London. And it's looking at sort of moving towards a more distance-based system of charging instead of as the next logical progression from the congestion charge that is now 16 years old and desperately needs reforming in order to be more responsive to the ways that we travel around the city these days, as well as the ULEZ, which of course is very welcome and new and addressing pollution. But we think that with the proliferation of charges, so we've got not only those two schemes, but you have tolling, potential tolling on the Silvertown Tunnel, on the Blackwall Tunnel as well, potentially at Heathrow. There's also the London-wide low emission zone. So if we were to replace all those schemes with a single scheme based on distance, that we believe that would be the next logical progression, but not from a revenue raising perspective, but more as a way to address local congestion pollution pressures. So in the scheme that we're suggesting, that would be a staged scheme. So it wouldn't be covering the whole city from day one, but it would be focusing on the most congested and polluted areas in the city. We're suggesting that as well as distance, the charge can be variable by many other factors, including vehicle size, vehicle emissions, the local congestion pollution levels of where the journey is. So for example, if you're traveling at peak times in a very congested road, then you would naturally be charged more than if you were traveling at night or in places in outer London where there are no alternatives. So the availability of alternative ways to make that journey and whether that journey is switchable, I guess the modelling will be able to tell you that, and you'll be able to price accordingly. As I said, yes, we're seeing that because the mayor has the power to introduce obviously charging, but for congestion pollution purposes only, and it cannot be used to, it will help towards making roads funding more sustainable. And I think the issue that we've got now is that roads funding is not sufficient, so the income and the revenue we receive from roads is obviously not sufficient to maintain our roads, and having a scheme as that would make sure that every journey is priced according to the impact that it's having in terms of network wear and tear, but also in terms of the negative impacts that it is having on people and the environment around it.
Okay, John, your thoughts?
Well, let me just add a couple of points to that. I mean, I think my start point would be that there is simply something wrong with the way in which we do transport funding, that TfL receives no money for roads. That just makes no sense. So quite how that should be fixed, there are a variety of ways that one could do it, but it is simply a ridiculous situation, and we should all spend every opportunity we get to make that point to central government. I think there is it's important we are clear about quite why we're doing things with Londoners. So I think it's very important that a congestion charge is run to reduce congestion, and that people can see the benefits of more reliable and shorter journey times where congestion charging is introduced. And ideally, it would command legitimacy before it's introduced, because people would believe it will work. And the lesson of not quite doing that, Manchester a few years ago, where people didn't think there was congestion, so why should they have a congestion charging system? I think that sort of demonstrates that point. A similar point is the case with ULEZ. It's very important that it's focused on reducing emissions. It is not focused on other things. And again, I think that's how you command public legitimacy and trust with those people paying it. Now, that said, there is a case for further charging to provide revenue to pay for the upkeep of London's roads. My start point would be that the first best way of providing revenue to pay for the upkeep of London's roads is that the existing substantial tax paid by Londoners should be in part channeled to this. That could be through the devolution of some of the vehicle excise duty. It could simply be by some kind of grant. I'm not precious about it, but my first thought would be it should be central government returning some of the tax revenues that London pays already to pay for roads.
Okay. I I personally wouldn't disagree with a word of that. Nicole?
Yeah, I think it's important that TfL and the Mayor make a strong case to central government that they need some level of grant, and without that it looks like we're heading in an unsustainable funding future. I think Silviya has already summarised that the current congestion charge is very simple. It's maybe not fit for purpose anymore. I think the only thing I would have to add there is that we also look at charging based on road damage. And so, for instance, heavier and lorries would pay more because they're requiring a more frequent maintenance schedule. And I think with any expansion of road pricing or congestion charging, we need to make sure that there are good public transport alternatives or cycling alternatives there, because without that, obviously, we're giving people a disadvantage and no alternative. And I mean, I would be strongly in support of expanding road pricing, the coverage of it, and also making it something that's, rather than just a daily charge, something which captures the impact on the road network, is either distance-based or time-based, and also reflects the congestion levels where you're currently driving, and the availability of alternatives.
Would you be in favour of doing that in the absence of any other changes?
No, so as I said, I think we need to invest in public transport, and I think the success of the congestion charge here in London has only been because there was more buses were run and more bus routes were run, and there was bus priority. So I think they need to come hand in hand.
So more public transport provision, but going back to something that John said a moment ago, motorists don't travel around for free. London has 2.6 million motorists, and they contribute £1.9 billion in taxes through using their vehicles. The vehicle excise duty, I think, is around about £500 million that is paid into central London, and not a penny of it is spent on London's roads. If that were not to change, if there was no change to vehicle excise duty, there was no lowering of fuel taxes, and road pricing was introduced on top of that, do you think that that would be a fair approach?
I think it would be reflecting, it should be reflecting the impact on the road network that your car has. And you taking a bus or you cycling has a much lower impact. Your footprint is smaller in emissions, but also literally how much space you're taking up. And therefore it should reflect that if we have congested roads here in London. I'm fully in support of central government should be devolving the vehicle excise duty to London, but we also need to think ahead when it's, we'll need to think, well, how are we going to be charging for that? A lot of the taxes paid for your cars are based on the emissions. If we move to a future where there's less cars are emitting less, then how are we going to be funding our roads? National government is also looking at road pricing, so London should step ahead and think about how are they going to do that.
Okay.
Can I add on that point? I think so the way that I say it is central government should be can be using road pricing for revenue raising purposes, and obviously HM Treasury has the power to tax vehicles and drivers in order to pay for the network, whereas from a city perspective it's very much different and focused on managing the negative impacts of driving in terms of managing the impacts of congestion and pollution. So the mayor has the power to charge drivers in order to address those impacts and not to raise revenue. So to me those things should be separate in a sense, and in London it would, so a new distance-based scheme would replace the existing congestion charge and ULS charges, at least in the proposal that we have put forward. So therefore it will not be an additional burden and cost on many drivers. In many cases it will be fairer on drivers because they might be paying less for a journey, which may be shorter. So rather than paying the set daily fixed charge, you would be actually paying for the journey that you are making, and mitigating those impacts, capturing the impacts that you are having.
Your report is based on a pan-London introduction of road pricing, isn't it?
Pan-London has a long-term ambition, but we're not. It should not necessarily be boundary-based, as the congestion charge or the ULS currently are. It's possible to cover a wider area, but only charging for journeys that enter certain congestion and pollution hotspots, for example, town centres or main commuting and main sort of motorways. in terms of technology, yes, that would be more complex than a cordon-based scheme. But technology is there. We have new technology that enables that distance-based charging through GPS in-vehicle devices or even through your smartphone. So you would not even need cameras to cover locations very densely, because they would just be used in order to capture those people that have not registered for the scheme. Yeah.
Just something I want to underline is that the scheme that you design depends on your objective, and maybe I didn't make that clear earlier on. So if your objective is to tackle congestion, you design a scheme in a certain way. If your objective is to, just generate funds, you design it in a different way. London may decide that they want a composite of that, but the two components will be different. Yes, a congestion charge to tackle congestion will generate funds, but that's not its main objective. And a road pricing scheme designed to generate funds will have congestion benefits, but that's not its main objective.
But I think in terms of a legitimate policy decision, I'm quite struck by what John said earlier on about people needing to believe things being done for a particular reason. I think in your report, if I'm correct, you proposed, I think as an example, a price of 8 pence a mile. Is that right?
I don't think we set a specific price. So Arab did some modeling for us for the report, and basically we devised a scheme where you have a base charge, which is your distance-based charge depending on your vehicle size and vehicle type. Then you have a multiplier on that depending on what type your vehicle is in terms of emission levels. You would have a separate multiplier for where the journey takes place, or geographical aspect to it, whether it's central, inner, outer London, or it might be based on travel card zones, for example. Then you would add on for congestion, and that would be based on recent observed levels of congestion on that specific route, as opposed to, say, having a charge that's ticking like a meter, and it would be predictable, transparent. You'd have obviously a multiplier for whether, for example, PETA, or whether there are alternative options for that journey. So it's a complex really way of setting a charge, which is why we cannot say a certain journey would cost X, and the amount of charging would obviously be a call for the mayor and for more complex TfL modelling. But to the customer, it would be a simple set charge that you would be able to input your starting and end point, and you would be given a set price, which you would then be able to compare to other modes, and then make an informed decision as to what choice you want to make for that journey.
You talked about the customer as well. One of the problems with the congestion charge, and famously, a great number of the embassies in London have refused to pay it, because the legal definition of the charge is a fee that you pay in exchange for a service, and they're saying we're not getting a service, this is a tax. And they refuse to pay it, and because they've got diplomatic immunity, they can get away with that. How would you package this in such a way that people believe they're receiving a service?
A scheme like that can deliver many benefits. So one of that is providing a level of service on the road. So for example, when you'll be ensuring that road maintenance is captured within the charge. So for example, you would be able to say, for the money that you pay, we're delivering a good quality network.
But the pushback on that, sorry to interrupt you, but the pushback on that will be, I'll go back to the point I made earlier on, that London's motorists are paying the best part of £2 billion in taxes already, and what are their taxes for if it's not for maintaining the roads? And
not much of that goes at the London
Indeed.
level.
I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yes, but this is the problem that you have, and this is why I asked Nicole the question earlier on. In the absence of any changes, would you be happy to support road pricing being introduced on top of all the taxation that motorists already pay? And broadly sweeping, the answer was broadly yes. Are you in the same position?
Ideally, yes, we would like to see some money devolved from government. It does not necessarily have to be VAT devolution. It could be having access to other broader funding pots. So, for example, other cities receive clean air zone implementation funding in order to implement CASs in city centres. They could be charging or non-charging, but that's an example where central government is supporting cities in that sense. And you could argue that London should receive similar types of funding to implement the ULEZ or whatever the sort of next stage of that is. So it does not necessarily have to be VD or VOGG devolution. But there is still a case to be made that the current system does not capture the impact that driving has in terms of negative impacts on the wider population. So it would be a fair system where you're paying for the impacts that you're having, but you would also have the benefit of having improved traffic flow, reduced congestion, and drivers benefiting from increased efficiency and productivity in that sense.
Well, that would only apply if they could still afford to use the road, of course, wouldn't it? Okay. Turning to TfL place then, Lucinda, how do you think the road should be funded?
I think, firstly, a broader point on the importance of stability and sufficiency of funding to enable us to invest across a system, including roads. And grateful to John for kind of reiterating that point. And the business community has been key in helping us kind of make that case. I think VED's kind of devolution would be eminently appropriate. We have made the case for that and will continue to do so and would welcome other people.
Oh yes, I mean on that subject it's one of the very few issues I think you'll get complete unanimity from just about everybody in this building and all of the GLA family groups, so you want a winner with that one.
We just need to persuade the government.
Yes,
we're also targeting particular sources of funding like the Major Roads Network funding, so we welcome the fact that some of London's roads were included in that. We have made bids. We're looking at trying to progress Gallows Corner, for example, but a number of other schemes. But I would say that welcome as it is, it's ad hoc, and we actually need that sustained investment and stability of it. I mean, in terms of road user charging, Proposal 21 in MTS does have the policy framework for that. At the moment, the clear focus in London is on the expansion of ULEZ and using pricing in that context to tackle the imperatives around air quality.
Okay.
May I add a quick point on the attractiveness of a system like that? So what we have said in the report is that so you would accompany road pricing with that multimodal system and journey planning application that I talked about earlier, and that would have benefits not only for drivers in terms of making the journeys fairer, easier to pay, simpler. So replacing the current scheme where we have separate payments for congestion, for pollution, potentially tolling. The journey of the experience of the driver would be simpler and easier. You could integrate parking as part of that, for example. The potential is quite large. But something, a scheme like that can have benefits to other users as well. And it's important to offer mitigation, I think, to that point. One, obviously you wouldn't be paying for journeys that you would have little alternative than driving. But secondly, you can offer, with an individual account, you can offer targeted discounts, targeted exemptions. You can offer scrappage scheme or sort of alternatives and rewards in the case, in the sense of mobility credits, so offering incentives to people to make a journey in different ways and having that comparability within a single platform where you can compare the costs, the journey times and the impacts of a single journey would have lots of benefits so that you can then have an informed choice of how to make that journey.
Trying to translate that into my own life experience. You know, people are busy, they get home from work, they have things they have to do. I mean, I drive less than 6,000 miles a year. I wouldn't dream of driving into central London, not least because it's the most inefficient way to get to central London from where I live. Most of my car journeys are around the locality that I live in. It might be taking my daughter training or something, or doing the family shopping, whatever it is. Most of the time, do you think it's realistic that people would sit there and look at an app to work out the various different journeys that they could do when they have a car on the drive?
So the option would be there if you need it, but I mean the technology can be such that it can recognize when you're getting in the car. So you would not need to input your details every time you get into the car in order to use the system, in order to be charged for it. I think yes, the option would be there. In terms of affecting poorer people that might not be able to have other options, There's also the point that poorer people drive less proportionately, and they tend to use buses more. So if you were to charge accordingly, and any investment that you put into public transport and buses, so poorer people would benefit disproportionately as well. In terms of the impacts of driving, there's evidence that obviously poorer people are more affected by congestion, by pollution and road danger. So, and
that's an average, though, isn't it? And that's a bit of a sweeping generalisation, because that a lot of that is based on where people live. So, and that assumes that poor people live exclusively in inner city areas where there's high congestion.
Yep.
But of course, poor people live everywhere. There's lots of poor people living in my constituency in Outer London. Many of those people do have cars, contrary to a lot of what the averages tell people. And this would make their lives very much worse.
But my point is that any improvement in any intervention that improves congestion and pollution would benefit poorer people disproportionately. So the benefits of that would outweigh any disbenefits to people that might not be able to.
Yes, but again, that's an average, because large parts, again, of my constituency does not have huge amounts of pollution. It's not in central London, it's not in the congestion charging zone, it's not where we know most of the air pollution is. It's in outer London on the borders of Kent, and the air there is generally quite good. There are still poorer people living there, and as we discussed earlier on, there are a very limited range of public transport options. If road pricing were introduced on a pan-London basis, this would make their lives much worse.
No, but in that case, because the scheme that we're suggesting, the charge would be variable depending on real congestion pollution levels, as well as availability of alternatives. So the journeys that you would be describing would not be charged at all, or very little, if at all, in the scheme that we're suggesting. So depending on where you choose to, if it's a pan-London basis, then you wouldn't be capturing areas like that are not affected by congestion and pollution.
Slightly conscious of time, Chair, and this is one of those subjects where you could probably spend an entire morning doing a seminar on it. So I'll move on to the next section, which is around the spending reviews. It's sort of a sweep-all question for everyone, because the Mayor has sent his Christmas list into the two candidates, one of whom is going to be Prime Minister in 2 weeks' time. And his transport asks were to restore TfL's operating grants, around about £700 million a year, committing to funding Crossrail 2, funding infrastructure such as the Piccadilly line upgrade and the Bakerloo line extension, and transferring suburban rail services to Transport for London. I'll start with you, John. Do you think those are the right asks? And if you do, what should be the priority order?
So I think those are pretty much the right asks. The priority we have organisationally is around the National Infrastructure Commission's plan for infrastructure for the country as a whole, based on the current government's 1.2% planned spend on infrastructure, planned public expenditure on infrastructure. Now that would be enough money to both deliver the Northern Powerhouse rail programme and the associated investment needs of the Northern Powerhouse and Transport for the North, to deliver HS2, assuming HS2 stays roughly where it is, which is an assumption, but critically from the point of view of London, to provide both the resources to deliver Crossrail 2 and also what one might describe as the routine capital programme for TfL around things like signalling, network enhancements, rolling stock and so forth. So that's our top ask of government, and I would certainly put that right at the top. In terms of other transport asks, it would of course be a good thing to see a return of some subsidy from the taxis Londoners pay to deal with the charges Londoners pay. And it's extraordinary, if you look at comparatively the performance of TfL, that it is getting close to making not only an operating surplus on the underground, but an operating surplus that would cover its financing costs. Now, there must be no network in the world, certainly no network in the world, of the age and complexity of the London Underground that's coming close to that. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why charges in London are high for those of us using the network. So I think some shift in the balance of that is right. I don't think we're going to get it in the near future, but I think it's right. So I think I would probably, if I was prioritising, put that behind the further devolution of rail services. Now, the further devolution of rail services is a difficult issue, I think, to think about in isolation, because there are sort of two things, two bits of complexity on this that I might just touch on. So one is, of course, devolving rail services to TfL without devolving resourcing to TfL.
Yes. Yeah.
Sort of creates the, you know, people, there's a risk that people will think this new bit of the overground is going to be like the North London line. And of course the North London line was transformed by TfL taking over, and £1 billion or two of investment in both rolling stock and the track. So I do think we need to be a little bit careful how we position this as a city. I think I'm in favour of greater devolution, but I do worry a bit about setting expectations and not being able to resource them. And the other thing we just always need to be conscious of and clear about is that we devolve services in a way that does not disadvantage those people commuting from a bit outside of the London travel zone. It's as important to business that people who are commuting from Brighton or Leicester or wherever are able to get into London just as easily as people living in outer London or people living in inner London. So, and that's of course perfectly doable. This is not a barrier, but it is a sensitivity that when we talk about rail devolution, I think we always need to be very mindful of. And I know it's something that does perfectly understandably worry, for example, members of Parliament from the home counties, because they see the sort of the great might of TfL and they see its accountability to the Mayor and to the Assembly, and quite what they got. So I think we need to be very mindful of that.
Lucinda, what would be the key ask for TfL?
Fundamentally, that sufficiency and stability of funding. We have to be able to make long-term committed investments. We need to make them in a sensible way that delivers efficiencies through our supply chains. We can't do that
Are you
at the
talking about
moment.
capital funding or revenue funding?
Sorry?
Are you talking about capital funding or revenue funding or both?
Both.
Right.
So we have had since 2011 a 46% cut in our sources of external funding. It is very difficult. We have taken a lot of action to prepare for that and to respond to it in terms of making savings, so £111 million of recurring savings each year. We have reduced the operating deficit, as John said. I mean, John has put much of it very eloquently. Absolutely agree with most of what he has said. And it also combines with the difficult macroeconomic circumstances where we have seen a softening in revenues as well, and we are more exposed to that. So we need that sufficiency and stability. I mean, for example, on the Piccadilly line, we have ordered the new trains. We have been able to do that. We haven't been able to commit to the procurement of the signalling upgrade, which would deliver that 60% uplift. Without that sufficient ongoing investment, we can't do so. And I absolutely agree that National Infrastructure Commission, they recognise that was established by this government, and they recognise that investment in London made sense economically and in many different ways. And as you say, their recommendation would equate to about £4.8 billion a year, shared between kind of us. But the MTS, to deliver the MTS in its entirety, we've estimated would cost about 3.3 kind of billion plus some for renewals. That would be manageable within that context.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Assembly Member Bailey.
Morning all. To Lucinda and Simon initially, what options did TfL submit to the financial review to pay for Crossrail 2 during the construction phase?
So in terms of Crossrail 2, we've identified a number of different sources. There was the original discussion and the kind of 50% London, 50% central government. That is very challenging. But we have assumed the use of Merrill Sill when it's finished being used for Crossrail 1. We have assumed the continuation of the business rate supplement, but also a potential uplift in that ahead of the kind of construction period to enable us to fund that. I'm trying to think what other sources. Let me just see. I mean, the challenge, there is a critical challenge not only in the scale of investment we're talking about, but also the timing of it, because a lot of the sources that are identified tend to come on stream or kind of ramp up most kind of after construction and after opening. So there's a financing kind of challenge as well. But I can follow up with you in more detail if you'd like to go into the kind of the specifics of the different sources identified. But definitely those are some of the sources.
I'd really like to follow up because I want to understand how optimistic you're being about this uplift and just how tight the timing is, because cash flow in these things is all. What will be the impact of the delay in Crossrail on our ability to deliver Crossrail 2?
Something we are looking at the moment. I think most tangibly, the use of mayoral sill has moved backwards because we now have had to make an assumption that won't become available for, say, around 8 years from when we were expecting to be able to kind of transfer it to Crossrail 2. I think there is a job for all of us to do to continue to make the case for that investment and to show that we are capable of delivery. We are getting our hands around Crossrail and that will be delivered and open as soon as possible. But I think that has kind of made people perceive kind of are we able to deliver? Absolutely believe we are, and if you look across the rest of our investment programme, we are. It is a hugely complex kind of project. And for business to support us, I think fundamentally Crossrail wouldn't be happening if the business community hadn't backed that case for investment, etc. So continuing to have that lobby, that kind of joint working is going to be fundamental to it.
Can I add? So we've done a fair amount of work over the years on how we might pay for Crossrail 2, looking both at the 50% funding target the government set and then the 50% financing target, which of course is providing money up front, which is an even greater challenge than paying for it over the course of its life, the 50% funding challenge. It is certainly the case that the delay around Crossrail has, I think, hurt us in two ways. It's hurt us firstly in terms of credibility around delivery, and there's no point pretending otherwise. But equally, we can be confident that bad as the delay in Crossrail 1 is and bad as the cost overruns around Crossrail 1 is, it is still the case that when Crossrail opens, it will have a transformative impact on our city. It will be a great addition to our infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Nobody, I think, will be quibbling about the extra cost in 10 years or 20 years' time, a little bit like the way the Jubilee line has been received once constructed. And we do need to remember that, as I say, bad as those things are, that it will be a great transformative benefit to the city. But of course the fact that it's going to be of the order of 1 to 2 billion over has 1 to 2 billion of cost taken out of the Crossrail
higher than that.
funding stream.
But you say 1 to 2 billion as if it's a trifling amount, and clearly it's not. And the problem
No, I'm honestly, 1 to 2 billion is real money. I get that.
And the problem is there a possibility then that it stops Crossrail 2 because money earmarked for Crossrail 2 is now being used to do other things?
It certainly sets a challenge to everybody involved in it. We are awaiting the government's response to the Gerrard Review, which has looked at ways in which we might be able to deliver the scheme, which may or may not produce some either cost savings, some phasing, some staging, some ways of making it more affordable, and we'll have to see what they've said and what the government responds. Our view is that the delivery of Crossrail 2 remains an essential need for this city. And so the question is, if we are going to still have to find that order of magnitude of funding from London's resources, I'm afraid I think we need to look a little bit more widely. We would not rule out using the limited powers the Mayor does have, the council tax, the fare box. There are interesting and innovative things one could do around pricing parts of Crossrail 2. There are things one could look at around, for example, its ability to deliver housing and quite how one could use some of the resources generated by housing to pay for it differently. There's a whole suite of things we should do. There will be no easy way of doing this. I mean, I can see no circumstances, much as I would like to, where central government's going to let, as it were, the people who make decisions about tax and spend in London off the hook by funding Crossrail 2 completely or nearly completely. So in the circumstances we're in, if we want it, we're going to have to find ways to pay for it. And we will have to find those ways, and we will have to do that in a way that is equitable across the people who will use it, the people who will benefit directly, the people who will benefit indirectly.
That compelling case for investment in Crossrail 2 and things like BLE kind of is still absolutely there. Just the other kind of source of funding that we submitted, the net operating surplus, again, clearly comes later in the day, so the financing issue is still there. But crucially, also income from overstation development. So that's a fundamental part of the planning kind of it, but also part of the funding package for it.
And I should also add that we've been supportive of the notion that the current business rate supplement would extend to part finance and fund Crossrail 2. And we wouldn't rule out other ways in which business might contribute as part of a balanced and sustainable funding package. We're not terribly attracted by the model that the only people who pay any extra are businesses in London. So funnily enough, that's not, we don't think that is a fair package.
That's my question. How saleable this is to business, because we made the comment earlier on that this has been a loss of confidence in our ability to deliver. Obviously, you'll be going back to businesses now asking for more, and they will point out that, well, you didn't deliver last time, or my business will still be here by the time we finish this next one.
So I think there can be no question that the delays in Crossrail have had an effect on the credibility of any funding scheme we put together. That does not diminish the need for the project, and business absolutely gets that. So a real challenge, I think, for all of us, again, over the next year or two as we move towards Crossrail opening, is to make sure that we have thoroughly learned and embedded in the next project the governance and operational learnings from what went wrong with Crossrail 1 in its later stages.
Lucinda, you alluded earlier on to new innovative ways you are looking to find this money, which is a considerable sum of money, and as been said by John, everybody around this arc will agree that Crossrail 2 is imperative. We want that, we need it, it'd be good for London and indeed the country. But can you just focus again on, excuse me, on what other things have you done to look for this money? Is there any sort of real sort of cutting edge ways you are looking at now to finance this project?
No magic bullets on this, unfortunately. Definitely maximising every bit we can from the overstation development. I think we've learnt in that context from Crossrail, and there is much that can be delivered that way. I mean, we go back to potential for land value capture and the kind of exploration of that, but at the moment that's not on the table from central government. So we are continuing to work with business and with others to look at the sources that we have identified so far and to maximise what we can get from those. But inevitably central government will have to step up and play a part. I think with Crossrail, kind of London bore a large kind of share of it. There are many places outside London that are benefiting, and that will be the case too for Crossrail 2. So a sharing of the kind of burden on this is going to be essential.
I suppose part of the mood music behind this, the ability to get government to step in and help, is to explain just how damaging the loss of Crossrail 2 would be to London. Have we detailed that anywhere? Have we been able to say to parliamentarians in and outside of London just what a damaging prospect it would be not to have Crossrail 2?
Yep, so a lot of that is set out in the strategic outline business case that we have resubmitted to government following the affordability review. So that re-emphasises the compelling nature of the case. I mean, it ranges kind of across from dealing with systemic and capacity constraints at places like Clapham Junction, at Euston, kind of with HS2, at Waterloo, all sorts of places that Crossrail 2 delivers those benefits. It delivers the agglomeration kind of benefits, that uplift in capacity for extending the kind of job market and access for businesses to kind of employees. It delivers the housing and the growth that we talked about earlier. It also delivers benefits way beyond kind of London's boundaries. In terms of kind of access for people, I mean, we have set out the case, we think, in a compelling kind of way. If there are any other aspects we should be incorporating.
And it is a broad-national case. You talked about southeastern trains and train paths going into Waterloo, where I think Crossrail 2 is really the only viable way of giving Network Rail more capacity. But of course, it's also true for the rest, for a wider part of the country than people might think. If we build HS2 out to Manchester and Leeds, and people from Manchester and Leeds come into Euston Station and they come in great trains and it's a quick journey and it's a reliable journey and they find themselves in holding pens at Euston because it's going to take them 45 minutes to get onto the Victoria line, they're not going to think that's such a great transport experience. So if we do not get extra capacity at Euston to deal with the full HS2 build, then we're going to be enormous problems about the ability to run an integrated transport network in London.
Okay, Chair.
Assemblymember Bacon.
Just one tidying up point for you, John. You placed great emphasis on the word just a moment ago when you said not just business should pay for Cross R2. Government, obviously. Anyone else that you had in your sights with that?
So I think I was thinking of the percentage of the scheme which is paid for by London.
Right.
Now, my start point would be that London already pays a large amount of taxation into the British government, and it is only reasonable that some of that taxation is returned to provide the infrastructure that not only supports continued economic growth, that supports increased taxation payments to central government, but makes the lives of those people delivering that economic return tolerable within London as they get around. Yeah. But it is clearly the case that government is not going to provide 100% funding for this project. Some funding will have to be delivered by London. Now, I would have a sort of broad approach to how that should be provided. As I said, I think earlier, the people who directly benefit should be paying for it. So they will, of course, pay through the fare box, and that will be the fare box surplus. There may be pricing issues that should be thought about, and particular parts of the route which could increase revenue. We should be thinking about the network as a whole, because, of course, the network as a whole benefits from increased capacity in the fare box there. We should be thinking about those people who benefit indirectly. Now, at the moment, pretty much the only way the Mayor can provide resources from London is through the council tax precept. I would not rule a contribution from the council tax precept out as part of paying for this. And then there are a range of other ways we might be able to raise more revenue. Lucinda's talked about greater OSD revenue, oversight development revenue, which I think is possible, but sort of baked into the assumptions already. There may be some value capture possibilities. I'm more sceptical about the scale of those than some people for the reasons earlier when we talked about quite where value capture occurs, but I think we should be looking at those. I think if London is serious about Crossrail 2, it will have to make some uncomfortable choices as to how we pay for it.
I mean, the trouble with value capture is that you can only realise the value when you liquidate the asset, i.e. sell it.
I agree. So I think it is, again, there is more that could be done around new commercial development. There is more that could be done possibly around housing development. So one of the difficult decisions that will have to be made is quite what the mix of housing development is going to be and how much revenue we wish to extract from housing delivery to support the infrastructure provision that enables that housing delivery. These are all difficult trade-offs. They will have to be made.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Just mindful, we've got one more section, and if members and our guests could keep comments and responses quite short, so we can finish this in about 15 minutes. Looking at developing the transport system for the future. Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. Good afternoon now. First question is, what in the transport strategy needs to be prioritised to ensure London's transport system delivers for Londoners? Is resilience to future constraints and plays a role in addressing the challenges facing the capital? John, if you want to kick off?
So I'm going to repeat myself, but the thing that matters most to us is increased capacity. It's increased capacity that creates the context for greater stability, greater certainty, higher quality journeys and so forth. So maintaining investment, delivering the critical upgrades we need, delivering the extensions to the network that will both unlock housing, support jobs and make it easier for people in different parts of London to get jobs. Those are the kind of critical parts of the strategy from business's perspective.
Okay, thank you. Lucinda.
I mean, the MTS sets out a whole package of interventions we think are necessary in the timescale to kind of 2041 to deal with the challenges London faces. I mean, inevitably you can say it's a broad and ambitious package, but necessarily so, I think, given the scale of London's growth and given the breadth of the issues that we are facing and the diversity of London. So, I mean, we are looking in this time frame to 2041 to deliver kind of the MTS as a whole. That's not just us who deliver it, though. I think it's important to remember that Network Rail, the boroughs, kind of others are crucial partners in delivering what's needed. I mean, then we have the business plan that prioritises in the kind of next 5 years what will be delivered within that framework.
Yeah, so I would just reiterate making better use of our infrastructure. So on the road, prioritising road users or road users that are high capacity public transport, looking at taking away residential parking on streets, looking at shifting people away from private car usage, private vehicle usage. On the rail-based network, looking at signalling, how can we increase frequency of services and how can we increase capacity on those services with new rolling stock. I think we've discussed at length just now the challenges to building new infrastructure, so I think looking at the short and medium term we need to make best use of our existing infrastructure.
Thank you. We are quite fortunate in London because we have strong political leadership and we have an integrated planning framework which has the MTS, the London Plan, the London Environment Strategy. Lots of parts of the country don't have that supportive set of conditions to help us deliver it, and we do need that because of the strength of the challenges we face. But I think really from our point of view the most important thing is to transform London through the 80% mode share target, through tackling health and through implementing the Healthy Streets approach, which puts human health and well-being at the heart of everything we do. And that is a completely different approach to what has been done in the past, and it's something I think which actually will transform London over the next 20 years.
Just moving on from that, Simon. A number of areas on the MTS we've seen slow progress on that. What do you think we need to prioritise? Which projects would you prioritise in the MTS to bring them back up to speed?
Well, we do try to review areas where more acceleration is needed. So we produce a document called Travel in London every year, and Travel in London is an assessment of how London is changing and how travel is changing in London and how we are moving towards the Mayor's transport strategy in a variety of different areas. Now within that we try to identify the areas where acceleration is needed, and that then feeds through into the business plan. So the approach which we adopt actually enables us to identify where acceleration is needed and then to make sure through our business planning work the areas which we need to focus on. So the areas within the business plan take that fully into account.
So which projects would you prioritise in time?
It's the projects which are set out in the business plan. Lucinda, do you have a list of them though?
Yeah, so
well, you can pick that up, Lucinda, if you like.
Yeah, some of them we've talked about. I mean, delivering the tube upgrade, so the 33% frequency uplift on the Circle District, Hammersmith and Met line. We're committed to completing that. Finishing schemes like Bank Station upgrade, kind of tackling pinch points on our network. Completing the Northern Line extension to Battersea, for example, rolling out those new trains on the Piccadilly line, but trying to persuade central government to provide sufficient funding to allow us to do the signalling as well. Continuing the Healthy Streets kind of delivery programme, accelerating actually the Safer Junctions programme. I think we're at about 21 out of the 73. We want to get to having delivered 41 of those schemes by kind of 2020. Continuing all the improvements on bus emissions, I mean, there's a whole series of priority schemes which, as Simon says, have been distilled into the business plan. So the business plan MTS is relatively unconstrained by finances, as we've discussed. We need further investment to deliver it. The business plan distills that into the priorities for the next 5 years.
So, which areas would you say have made good progress on the MTS?
I think we've seen good progress across a lot of the areas. We've talked a lot about the delivery of improvements in emissions. So we're now at 75% of our bus fleet meets Euro 6 emission standards. I mentioned the Safer Junctions improvement programme. We have completed a significant kind of number of schemes kind of there, and finishing at Highbury Corner, for example, kind of, and many others. Step-free access, we had the 78th step-free station on our underground network opened earlier this year at South Woodford. We're working on Harrow on the Hill, Mill Hill East, kind of a range of others which we are kind of committed to delivering. I talked about the rollout of new trains as well. We will be seeing the London Overground trains are being rolled out. We will be seeing the new trains coming on the DLR. I think we are making good progress, some of which has already crystallised, some of which will crystallise over the next few years and deliver that step change. So, as John said, when Crossrail kind of opens that step change in capacity, when the Circle line kind of and other line upgrades happen, that will deliver a further step change. So
on the you mentioned Safer Junctions, are we actually seeing any shift at all towards the Mayor's Vision Zero? I mean, recently I saw a report where there have been a number of deaths recently on our roads. As Simon pointed out, we're not tackling the issue around motorcyclists. Are we any nearer Vision Zero?
We are seeing progress, and we're committing to doing kind of more action to deliver Vision Zero. Every single death on our roads and our system is regrettable, and we wish we could avoid it. There have been a number of incidents kind of in recent months with cyclists as well, so we are doing everything we can to kind of deliver that in practice. There are definitely improvements though, and the trends are kind of going in the right direction, but we clearly have more to do.
We saw a trial of a system that reduced accidents on buses, which has been very successful, and the Mayor has chosen not to roll that out across the rest of the network.
I'm afraid I don't know that specific detail. I can
Mobileye. Perhaps you could look into that.
I will.
And just finally then, we see that in 1718, 30% of Londoners reported that they had less than 10 minutes period of active travel every day. What do you think we could do around that? Are there any quick wins we could do around that?
It's certainly a challenge, and some things take time to deliver. But on that front, I think I mentioned the consultation that we've had on 20-mile-an-hour zones, for example. And some of the responses to that are clearly indicating that by lowering speeds and making kind of less traffic-dominated environments, people would be willing to walk and cycle more. The Cycle Action Plan sets out significant kind of measures to improve things. I think I mentioned safety and too much traffic being kind of issues there. So across our programme, rolling out that Healthy Streets investment, that £2.3 billion over the course of the business plan, is going to fundamentally shift some of the kind of the willingness of people to walk and cycle and the comfort they feel in doing so. We need to deliver the kind of environments that support people to walk and cycle.
Nicole mentioned something earlier, and you can come in after Lucinda, if that's all right, about the fact that we're not able to, I'll use the word legislate, wasn't the word you used actually, or control, it might be you as well, control what's going on. So, for instance, when we have innovation, like we've got the electric scooters, we've got the guys who go up and down Oxford Street in their pedicabs, electric bikes, push bikes we have now, and then there's the arrival of the dockless bikes and so on. And it seems that the main problem we have is that there is no legislation to enable TfL or any other regional body to react to these rapidly changing innovations. And what I would ask is, how can we overcome that? And would perhaps a system whereby the government gave TfL or regional bodies an overarching power to introduce bylaws or other kind of laws to react to these things more quickly, rather than every time something happens, we have to go to the government to get primary legislation, which takes so long, and clearly most of the time they've got more priorities. I mean, I think there's even something ridiculous about black cabs having to carry bales of hay in the back of their vehicles for the horses. But we had no power to overcome that. So what do you think around that?
I think that's a very interesting proposition, and one that I'll definitely take back and discuss, because you're absolutely right. We have significant challenges that things develop really quickly and can sometimes catch us on the hop if we're honest. We've done a lot to try to make sure that we are doing that horizon scanning and understand some of the changes kind of potentially impacting. But again, you're right that a lot of our levers and regulations are quite old. I mean, centuries old, some of them. So I think it's a very interesting potential option to tackle this. I mean, at the moment, we currently identify particular regulatory changes, etc., that we think would help us to tackle some of these issues, but something more flexible and quicker would certainly be of interest. I know Paris is struggling particularly with e-scooters. There's a big debate in the city kind of there, and they have even fewer kind of regulations, I think, to manage that. So
I can tell you, in Brussels, it's working. In Brussels, it's working very, very well.
Interesting.
You know, there's 3 or 4 scooter providers. They're all parked up very neatly, and people are really getting around. I use them myself. Nicole, did you want to comment, and I'll come back to you, Simon?
Yes, so on the topic of dockless bikes or e-scooters, I think it is really important to give cities the right powers to manage this new mobility or any new tech that comes along.
Yeah.
And it is really key to the success of those schemes. So if the city can say, you know, we'll give you a license, but you need to... the idea is really around virtual bays, so places where you can leave these new vehicles and not present clutter on the footpaths. So if cities can go to the operators and say, hey, we're going to give you some space to do that, but you have to abide by our rules, then that's a way that you can make a success of them, rather than them being clutter, rather than there being a lot of negative emotions associated with these new innovations.
And that works within the app, because when you park up the e-scooter in Brussels, if you don't park it in the right place, they penalise you. And if you park it in the right place, oh, thank you very much for parking in the right place. So it can be done. But again, it's just the point about having government giving us overarching powers to make smaller regulations to react more quickly to this stuff.
So I know that national government was probably like 9 months ago looking into having some legislation on, in particular, dockless bikes, but that seems to have stalled because of, I guess, the focus on Brexit.
But that's
and
the
London,
point. That's just about dockless bikes. My point is about giving broader powers.
No, exactly.
So it does not just dockless bikes. It could be e-scooters.
Exactly.
It could be.
So completely in support of your point.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Simon, do you want to come in?
Well, I just wanted to add a point about active travel, because we have seen some very strong growth in cycling in 2018, and I think that is it's very relevant to this topic. So since 2016, we've had something like 140 extra kilometres of cycle route put in, and the monitoring which my team does is starting to show that there are some very substantial changes happening. So we've had 5% growth between 2017 and 2018 in cycling across the whole of London, and that means we've reached 4,000 kilometres cycled, which is the highest level it's ever been. And this is quite substantial growth, and all of the satisfaction surveys that have been done with the new routes have been positive, perceptions of safety have been positive, and everywhere that we've monitored where there's a new route has been above that background trend. So there are some very positive things coming out about activity in the cycling frame.
Thank you. Assemblyman Bashar.
Thank you. I have questions on 2 major development projects. HS2, we'll start with. What will be the impact of HS2 on London? Who wants to take on? Lucinda?
I I can start. A number of significant aspects. Clearly, there's a huge focus on Euston and Old Oak Common in terms of stations and interchange and managing those impacts. More widely, there are clearly so many kind of issues about the interaction with our system, about construction traffic, about kind of managing the delivery of that project. So our focus is very much on ensuring that the impacts on London are mitigated and that the opportunities are maximised. So if we take Euston, for example, it's important to bear in mind that at Euston, a hugely complex kind of scheme. You've got HS2, you've got the conventional network rail station project, and you've got the kind of wider associated development and master planning. These are three kind of projects that need to be integrated and come together because they all interact with London's transport system and local transport systems. So we are working with all partners to ensure that, for example, that London Underground infrastructure is improved and enhanced and made adequate to deal with the increased kind of flow, so the tunnels and the station, everything else. So HS2 need to ensure that they provide the funding for that and provide the mitigation for that. We're working to ensure that we can maintain a really effective bus interchange there. There's a sense that kind of whenever you get new development in London, they tend to want to move buses and bus stations and bus standing out. We know that it's a fundamental kind of interchange and forms part of the onward distribution for passengers, but also is hugely important for local communities. So we are working with HS2 to design kind of an improved interchange, because I don't think anyone would argue that the kind of environment at Euston Station at the moment is particularly particularly pleasant. So we need to get kind of improvements there. We're looking at healthy streets. So Euston Road will have closed lanes for quite a few years. So we're looking at the opportunities to improve north-south connectivity and crossings for pedestrians and all sorts of things, so that we can take advantage of the opportunities that are presented to that to really transform the area. Old Oak Common, similarly, we are looking at provision of kind of walking and cycling connections to the HS2 station. We're doing a kind of bus strategy. There is a lot of master planning involved in those areas, but the implications, I think, for local communities in terms of the levels of disruption and trying to encourage as much material by rail and minimise kind of lorry movements, etc., is a kind of really important part of our work more widely. And also persuading kind of and making sure that HS2, for example, implement the direct vision standards in all their contracts and in all the work we do. So we can follow up with you in detail about all the work we're doing with HS2. There is a huge programme of work to make sure that London is not impacted kind of adversely, and that we can kind of, on the flip side, we can take advantage of the opportunities. But as John mentioned, that onward distribution from Euston, for example, that Crossrail 2 delivers, to make sure that we have that tube capacity is key.
That would be helpful if you can give us information. And also, how do you actually work with not only HS2, but in terms of planning preparations, etc., with the MDC when it comes to Old Oak Common Park Royal? We can follow up with you on that in detail. Anybody else wants to come in on this? Okay. Now, the architect of MDC and the one who supported HS2, we believe, Mr. Johnson, he has said he would prefer investment on infrastructure projects in north of the country, and called for the review of economic benefits of HS2. And indeed, there are a number of reviews being considered from different levels. What will be the impact to London if HS2 is scrapped? What work is being done on that? Because that seems to be a realistic sort of risk that we are facing, and that's going to change the whole story in terms of what we are trying to deliver.
I mean, our work with partners on HS2 at the moment is just assuming that the project goes ahead. There is a significant focus on cost reduction and value engineering and trying to get it, ensure that it's within the funding envelope. But at the moment, kind of, we're working with partners on the assumption that it is being delivered, and we need to do everything we can to make sure the impacts on London are kind of managed.
I know that the mayor is, well, he said that he will be engaging with the new Prime Minister, whoever is going to be, more than likely, obviously, as we know, would be Mr. Johnson. Well, the mayor is hopeful, but again, should you not be working with all partners to look at this Plan B, which is risk of HS2 being scrapped? John, you want to come in?
I might just emphasise the importance to which the northern cities attach to HS2. And I think if the government were to materially change the plans around HS2, I think that would have a terrible effect on the sense of trust that the northern cities have, particularly Manchester and Leeds, but more broadly. And I think that would play into the whole credibility of the Northern Powerhouse investment suite. So I think this would have two big implications. I think the first one is it would be very dislocative and divisive within England, which I think would be a very bad thing, obviously.
Sure.
But also it'd be very bad for London, because there are no circumstances where the current government, a new Conservative-led government, is likely to go ahead with Crossrail 2 and not be investing substantially in other parts of England. So this is why we're so strongly in favour of the National Infrastructure Commission's approach, because it does provide a suite of funding meeting the needs of different city regions in England. And I think an approach that disrupts that is going to be pretty bad for pretty much every city region.
Anybody else wants to come in before I move in? Okay, the last question from me on the matter of Heathrow expansion. If the Heathrow expansion does go ahead, what are the key projects which will need to be delivered to ensure high quality surface access to airport? Obviously, we need to address issues of severe overcrowding, as well as encouraging modal shift, which is so essential for sustainable transport.
Do you want me to have a go at that? Okay, so we are currently at the stage where the national policy statement has been designated by the Secretary of State. The Mayor has appealed against that with a judicial review. That was turned down. We're now appealing the judicial review outcome. But meanwhile, the DCO is progressing. So there's a statutory consultation that's just been launched by Heathrow. And our concerns are around air quality, noise, and surface access. And your question is particularly about surface access, but they do link together, particularly the air quality aspect of it. Now, to explain why we are very concerned about this, you need to understand that Heathrow currently has something like 75 million passengers per annum passing through it. In 2031, after it's opened, it would have something like 132 million passengers passing through it. And that's probably, in terms of sort of surface transport demand, that's something like 130,000 more trips per day going to and from Heathrow, which is already a major traffic generator. Now, the national policy statement has some targets in it, and the targets are to have a 50% passenger mode share by 2030 and to reduce employee car travel by 25%. Now, our analysis suggests that if you did that, you'd still be generating a lot of traffic every day, 30 to 40,000 extra vehicles per day. So we don't think the MPS goes far enough, and there's another pledge around, which is around no more vehicle traffic in an expanded Heathrow. We think that is really important, that that is achieved, and it's achieved in a realistic, sensible way. So the problem with that, of course, is that if you do achieve no more car traffic coming to the airport, you end up by having a lot of extra public transport journeys. And you need the no extra traffic for air quality reasons, But if you end up with, I think at the moment we've got 90,000 public transport trips going to Heathrow every day, and with no extra traffic, it could be as high as 240,000. Now, the proposals, as they currently stand, have absolutely no additional public transport rail-based capacity to accommodate that enormous uplift in demand. And that is at the heart of our surface access objection. So we think that, and we've been saying for many years, that the Southern Rail link to Heathrow is an essential scheme if you're going to expand Heathrow to this scale. Now, I was fortunate enough, or misfortunate enough, to be involved in the Heathrow Terminal 5 inquiry a little while ago. And all the way through that, we were told we didn't need to have a condition that the Southern Rail link was required to enable it, the fifth terminal to be built, because it would come along anyway, and it had a scheduled opening date of 2003, and it's still demonstrating no progress. We're still at the stage of trying to identify objectives with the DfT. So getting a realistic commitment to Southern Rail link is important. Also, the Western Rail link is very important as well. And at the moment, what we see is that schemes which were designed to accommodate London's wider growth, things like Crossrail, things like the Piccadilly line extension, are being relied upon to absorb the effects of this expansion. And that's not what they were designed to do, and it compromises their ability to do what they were designed to do. So this is a big issue for us, and we want to see improvements to bus corridors, we want to see improvements to walking and cycling access to the airport, and none of this is materialising as we speak.
Chair, I'm mindful of time, so unless any of the other members want to come in.
Very small point, John.
I'm also mindful of time. I would just emphasise, I mean, we support, of course, the expansion of Heathrow, but it does need to be accompanied by improved surface transit access. There are two obvious things that should be done. The first is we need to increase public investment in connectivity to Heathrow, most obviously in the short term through Piccadilly line signalling, which would increase capacity. The other is the Department of Transport has looked at ways of attracting private investment to fund things like Southern Rail, but has done so in what one might describe as a not very effective way. So the department, I think, needs to get its act together about providing a framework which will enable the private sector to deliver the kind of increased capacity around Heathrow that can be delivered that we need.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much, and apologies that we did overrun. Just to thank our guests for a really interesting discussion this morning. John, Lucinda, Nicola, Simon and Silviya, who's already left us. Members, can we note the report and the discussions?
Noted.
Thank you. And we've just got one additional item to lead on. I'll call. Can we just agree for your delegated authority to me via the party lead and Assemblymember Pigeon to note the final output for our investigation into London transport now and in the future? Yep. Great. Just to ask our guest from London TravelWatch to come down, please.
So we can't investigate anything. There's too many questions in these meetings. You can't get into the detail of anything. It happened yesterday, it happened today as well. I think it's time to complain. Yeah, well, would you not want to complain? I'll just sort
Right. Just to welcome our two additional guests for this last session, which we'll keep quite brief. Joanne Simmons, who's the interim chair of Chief Exec of London TravelWatch, and Arthur Lee, who's the chair of London TravelWatch. Can I just ask Joanne and Arthur to briefly introduce to the committee your updated progress report?
Thank you, Chair, and I know time is short. Just very briefly, I wanted to say that obviously since we last came, there's been a lot of change within London TravelWatch. We've had a new board constituted with 3 new members. They've brought a new dynamic to London TravelWatch in terms of focusing on the customer. And that's helped us develop a new relationship with yourselves. I know we've had meetings with both yourselves and members of your staff, which has been very important. As you also know, Janet Cook left in April after 11 years with London TravelWatch. So we've moved very quickly from that. Joanna Simons, who will speak in a moment, has hit the ground running in terms of working with our team, with our staff, during an unsettled period, so it's needed some work to work with staff. But I think it's been very important to get them to think in a way that involves the committee here, but also other partner organisations. And Joanna will talk a little bit more about that. I'd just like to say really that I'd just like to voice my appreciation of the support that the committee has given in recent months. There has been a lot of change, and your work with us has been extremely helpful, so thank you for that. Looking forward, and Joanna will mention a little bit about this, clearly we want to expand that relationship with yourselves in a meaningful way that works for transport users. So it's absolutely key that anything we do has a meaningful impact. And I think the work with yourselves in terms of particular programs of work, prioritising, but also working with other partner organisations such as Transport Focus and others to really develop our knowledge so that we can bring immediate improvements. So I won't say anything more for the moment. I'm sure you'll have questions, but I'd like to introduce Joanna, if I may, who can go into a bit more detail.
Thanks very much, Arthur, and thank you again. And if I could just echo the thanks to the help that we've received from the staff thus far. We do have a little bit of a way to go, but I'm very confident that by the end of this financial year we'll have some very strong links in place at officer level to make sure that the joint planning is actually carried forward in a better way in the future. If I could just highlight 3 issues in relation to the report, again mindful of time. Firstly, I think it's really important that we've got a big focus for the future on the arrangements in existing Memorandum of Understanding. There has been some misinterpretation in the past, and our requirement to have an independence from operators has rather unfortunately got misinterpreted and led to some distance appearing between some of the team and the committee. Now that is something we're absolutely committed to putting right. What we want to see for the future is that we become a resource, and particularly with the specialist knowledge that some of the staff had, that we can feed into future work here. And I thought very much listening to the previous debate, there's a lot more we can do, particularly around buses. Secondly, just briefly to improve resilience, one of the recommendations the committee has made in the past has been for us to look to ways to reduce duplication, particularly in relation to rail consultation work with Transport Focus. Now the board has actually taken this a little bit further, and we're now proposing a strategic partnership that will enable us to streamline the back office. We do have cost pressures at the moment, and the only way really we can tackle those is actually by minimising behind the scenes the joint work that we do, reducing duplication, because the really important thing is making sure that our policy and casework team have more time to actually spend on the very specific nature of London issues. The report does go into detail about the proposals in relation to the partnership. Very happy to take questions. And then again, very mindful of time, just finally, in terms of current priorities, we appreciate the difficulties last year with the previous business plan. Clearly work is needed to continue this year. And in addition to the general business as usual, just highlighted a few measures of current activity. I particularly draw your attention to the bus safety research. What this has been doing is to look at occupant safety actually on buses. Now, in many ways, these are very small-scale problems that happen for people, but they're particularly targeted at the particularly vulnerable people that suffer. There's been a whole range of different recommendations coming out of this. I'm pleased to say the team are talking to some of your scrutiny officers in a week or two about the detail. We're very hopeful that some of these can be taken forward and will form part of our future work programme over the next couple of years. Other than that, I think the rest of the report's fairly self-explanatory, but clearly we're very happy to take questions on any aspect.
Were there any questions from members? No, the only thing I wanted to flag up is just to thank you for the progress, and it's good to see a lot more focus in terms of London TravelWatch's purpose annual aims and that closer collaboration and making sure there isn't the duplication. One thing I did want to pick up on is this proposal for a joint chief executive arrangement with Transport Focus, and that was something that I understand that was mentioned, but now it seems like it will be a firm proposal with the Chief Executive Transport Focus taking the interim role first.
Yes, the intention behind it, obviously subject to approval by this committee and also the sponsoring body for Transport Focus, would be to enable us to reduce the cost of that top level of management. The difficulty for somebody, and I'm doing a post at the moment, running a very small organisation, is there's a disproportionate focus on things like the necessary corporate governance, so whether that's I've been spending a lot of time recently on the budget and with the auditors, and this detracts from actually having time to be where it really counts, which is the work in relation to specific transport-related activity. The intention would be that, obviously I'm here on an interim basis, that we would have a shared arrangement similarly to many local authorities and health trusts have been doing this recently. So some of those bigger picture things would be partially taken up by Anthony, but it would free up resources to enable us to have more dedicated focus and concentration on working closely with you. And just very briefly...
So what's the timescales for that?
That would, subject to your approval, we'd be putting that into place to start towards the end of this financial year.
Okay.
And just to say, following through in terms of the next bit of business planning, we will be in touch with your relevant group policy leads over the next coming week, just to make sure that we're feeding into relevant thinking for Assembly members in the next iteration of the plan.
Great. Maybe that's something we'll discuss further. Okay, great then. Thank you very much. Members, can we agree the recommendations that's set out in the order paper, including to confirm and release the grant funding for London TravelWatch for the second half of this financial year?
Chair.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Just a few more items of business before we can all leave. Apologies, members. Can we just note the work programme for this financial year? And there's just one other small urgent item for business. So following the receipt of the letter from the Deputy Mayor for Transport regarding the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf Bridge, we have a meeting scheduled for Friday the 19th of July for a Q&A session with the Deputy Mayor. Can we note this, please?
Noted.
Great. The date of the next meeting is scheduled for Friday the 19th of July, time to be confirmed in the Chamber. Thank you very much.